Her father crouched beside a hole in the frozen ground, straw lining its walls, and lowered a tin cup of water into the dark. The frost had whitened everything above, the fence posts, the boot prints, the edge of the board that covered the pit. He pulled the cup out an hour later. The water had not frozen. He took a handful of straw and squeezed it in his fist, then opened his hand and let the stems spring apart. The warmth lives in the air between them, he said. He was dead within 2 winters, and now she was standing in October wind with 63 cents and no roof, staring at 10 tons of the same material her father had used to keep a cup of water liquid in December. Mabel Ives stood at the edge of the North Fork threshing ground with her trunk beside her and loose wheat straw stinging her face. The stack rose behind her, 22 feet long and 20 feet across, its weathered skin dark gold where rain had beaten the outer layer flat. She was 18 years old. She had 63 cents, and the men walking toward her carried a ledger she had not altered. Theodore Kipp reached her first. He moved the way former ranch foremen moved, unhurried, feet planted wide, chin tucked against the October wind. Behind him came Galen Fitch, who held the ledger open against his chest like a man presenting evidence to a circuit judge. 2 other ring members trailed at a distance, close enough to witness, but far enough to claim they had not participated. Theodore stopped 6 feet from her trunk. "The ring cannot house you while this stands unresolved," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Behind his words sat the weight of a man who had chaired the Settlement Relief Committee for 9 years and had never been overruled. Galen stepped forward and turned the ledger so Mabel could see the columns. $23 in grain receipts, he said. Entered in your hand, collected by no one. Mabel looked at the numbers. They were her figures, the same careful strokes she had learned writing her father's well-digging invoices when she was 14, but the totals had been changed. 2 entries showed weights she had never recorded. A delivery date had been moved forward by 3 days, placing it on a Sunday when the freight office was closed. She opened her mouth to say so and saw the way Theodore was watching her, not with anger, with exhaustion. He had a committee to manage, a winter to prepare for, and a girl who might or might not be a thief standing between him and the work that kept 40 families alive. "I did not change those figures," Mabel said. Galen closed the ledger. "Then who did?" The question sat in the air between them. Mabel knew the answer. She had copied 3 pages of the original entries before Galen had taken the books back, and those pages were pressed flat beneath her clothing, their edges cutting into her ribs with every breath. But copied pages without corroborating freight receipts looked like exactly what Galen would call them. Numbers written by an angry, dismissed clerk trying to reverse her own guilt. Theodore exhaled through his nose. "You have until sunset to move beyond the settlement fence." 24 days remained until December 1st. On that date, $18.70 came due on the quarter section her father had filed before his lungs filled with fluid and killed him in the winter of 1909. Mabel had no horse, no wagon, no relatives closer than an aunt in Wichita who had not answered a letter in 2 years. 12 miles of treeless Oklahoma Panhandle lay between her and Goodwell, where the Panhandle Agricultural Institute had opened 2 years earlier, and where, theoretically, someone might need a cook or a clerk. But she could not walk to Goodwell. If she left the county, Galen would declare the mortgage note abandoned and take the land. The railway offered no free passage. The next settlement offered no guarantee of shelter or work. And 63 cents bought exactly nothing that could change any of those facts. She had 1 wool blanket, 1 canvas bedroll, a kettle, a tin pan, a knife, a hay hook, a grain scoop, and a 12-foot hay knife that had belonged to her father. She had 28 pounds of food: cornmeal, beans, salt pork, dried apples, and 2 gallons of kerosene for a single burner lamp stove that could heat a pan but not a room. She had 80 feet of used baling wire, kinked and recoiled so many times the ends were sharp as needles. She had her father's land papers. She had the copied ledger pages hidden against her skin. And behind her, abandoned by the threshing ring because it was cheaper to leave than to haul, stood 10 tons of wheat straw. Galen watched her inventory the contents of her trunk with the attention of a man confirming that his opponent held no cards. When she did not move, he leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "Sign the land over," he said. "I will forgive the note. You walk away clean." Mabel looked at him. Galen Fitch was 47 years old, treasurer of the threshing ring, grain buyer for 3 counties, and the man who held the paper on her father's quarter section. A rumored rail loading spur would cross that land within 2 years. The quarter section was worth more than anyone in the settlement understood, except the man offering to take it for the price of an $18 debt. "No," Mabel said. Galen straightened. "Sunset," he repeated, and walked back toward the ring buildings without looking at her again. Theodore lingered. He did not offer help. He did not say he believed her. But he did something that would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet. He walked a slow circle around the abandoned straw stack. 10 tons, he said, half to himself. Weathered outside, dry inside, meant for bedding and emergency cattle feed. He kicked the base. Loose stems scattered across the packed earth. 22 by 20 at the ground. 6.5 feet at the crown, maybe 7 where the stacker piled it heaviest. He turned back to Mabel. "You would need a framed shack, a tight roof, 6 cords of fuel, a stove, and at least 2 men to raise the walls before hard winter sets." He paused. "You have none of those things." Mabel said nothing. She was looking at the stack. "Do not think about entering that pile," Theodore said. His voice sharpened for the first time. "You cannot hollow a stack like a pumpkin. Pull the wrong armful, and the roof follows it down. That thing will either bury you or burn you." He waited for her answer. She gave him none. He shook his head once and followed Galen toward the settlement. The sun sat 3 fingers above the horizon. Mabel had until it touched the ground to decide whether to walk toward Goodwell with 28 pounds of food and no destination, or to stay beside a pile of dead wheat stems and bet her life on something she had seen her father do with a tin cup of water when she was 11 years old. She dragged her trunk toward the stack. The ledger pages cut against her ribs as she moved. 3 sheets of cotton rag paper, each one covered in figures that Galen Fitch had not expected anyone to copy. Grain weights received from 6 farms, fuel charges billed to the ring, delivery dates that did not match the freight agent's schedule. Mabel had noticed the discrepancies in September while reconciling the season's accounts, and she had done what her father had taught her to do with numbers that did not balance. She had written them down separately in her own hand, with the date and the source beside each entry. That diligence had cost her everything. When she brought the errors to Galen privately, he had smiled and told her she must have transposed the figures. 2 days later, the ledger showed new entries in her column, and Galen told the ring committee that their clerk had concealed $23 in grain receipts. It was a small enough amount to be plausible, a large enough amount to justify expulsion, and precise enough, 23, not 20 or 25 or, to sound like a real discovery rather than a round accusation. Mabel reached the stack and pressed her hand against its western face. The outer straw was stiff, rain-flattened, and cold. But beneath her palm, through the compressed surface, she felt what she had hoped to feel: warmth, not heat, not the dangerous warmth of wet straw rotting from the inside. A gentle difference between the October air and the still interior, where 10 tons of dry stems trapped motionless pockets of air that the wind could not reach. Her father had shown her this, not with a straw stack, with a potato pit, a hole 2 feet deep lined with dry straw filled with root vegetables covered with more straw and a board weighted with stones. In December, when the ground froze hard enough to wring under a boot heel, he had lowered a tin cup of water into the pit and pulled it out an hour later, still liquid. The frost had whitened everything above ground, but the cup sat in a pocket of air that had barely moved since autumn. He had taken a handful of straw and compressed it in his fist, then opened his hand and let the stems spring apart. The warmth lives in the air between them, he had said. Still air does not carry heat. Moving air steals it. Every stem holds a little pocket of nothing, and nothing is what keeps the cold from reaching through. Owen Ives had not been a scientist. He had been a dry land farmer and well digger who died of pneumonia at 41. But he had understood, in the way that people who work with materials understand, that insulation was not about generating heat. It was about preventing heat from escaping. Mabel pulled the 12-foot hay knife from her trunk. The blade was narrow, slightly curved, and serrated on one edge, designed to slice through compacted hay or straw the way a bread knife slices through a loaf. She had watched her father use it to cut feeding portions from stacked hay. She had used it herself, working for the threshing ring, to trim stack faces after the mechanical stacker had finished its work. She pressed the blade into the western face of the stack and began cutting an exploratory slot. The outer layer resisted for 3 inches, then the knife moved freely through the drier interior straw. Warm air flowed from the opening. It smelled like August moss dust, dry stems, the faint sweetness of old grain husks. She cut deeper, 2 feet, 3 feet. The knife handle vibrated as it passed through a denser band where the stacker had compressed the straw. Then the resistance changed. Wood. Mabel withdrew the knife and pushed her arm into the slot up to her shoulder. Her fingers found a vertical surface. Rough, square-cut, solid. A post. She shifted 2 feet to the right and cut again. Another post. 4 buried uprights. The remnants of a feeding rack that someone had built before the threshing ring piled straw around it and over it and forgot that it existed. That discovery changed the shelter from impossible to merely lethal. A stack without internal support could not hold a cavity. Remove straw from the center and the weight above would collapse into the void, exactly as Theodore had warned. But a stack containing 4 posts connected by crossbeams had a skeleton. The straw could be excavated from inside the frame while the frame carried the roof load. The cavity would not be a hollowed pumpkin. It would be a room inside a cage surrounded on all sides by the densest insulating material available on a treeless plain. Mabel cut a wider slot and began pulling straw from around the nearest post. The work went quickly at first. Loose interior stems came free in armfuls. She stacked them beside the opening where the wind would not carry them away. Then the upper face of the stack shifted. The movement was small, perhaps 6 inches, but the sound was enormous. A deep, fibrous groan as several tons of compressed straw adjusted to the void she had created below. A sheet of loose material slid from the stack face and struck her across the shoulders. She went down hard, pinned between the ground and a weight that pressed the air from her chest. She could not breathe. The straw covered her head, her arms, her hands. The hay knife was somewhere beneath her. She twisted and felt the blade's serrated edge against her forearm, not cutting, but close. She freed her right hand by pulling it through the straw the way a swimmer pulls through water, then her left. Then she crawled forward on her elbows until her head cleared the pile and she could draw air. Her blanket was buried. She pulled it free and found that the straw had torn a strip from the wool where the weight had dragged it across the knife edge. Her first act of independence had cost her half of the only bedding she owned. Mabel sat in the dirt beside the damaged stack and pressed the torn blanket against her chest. The sun touched the horizon. Beyond the settlement fence, she could hear Galen's voice giving instructions to someone about morning freight, the ordinary sound of a man who expected her to be gone by dawn. She looked at the slot she had cut. It was ragged now, the edges collapsed where the upper straw had shifted. But through the opening she could see the post, square cut, solid, waiting. She did not know whether the 4 posts were connected by crossbeams. She did not know whether the frame could carry the weight of several feet of straw above it. She did not know whether the interior was wet or heating or riddled with rats. She knew that the air inside was warmer than the air outside. She knew that her father had kept water liquid in December, using the same principle at a fraction of the scale. And she knew that Galen Fitch expected the winter to remove her before any judge could examine his figures. Mabel spent that first night in the shallow recess she had cut. No deeper than her shoulders, open to the wind on one side, the torn blanket pulled over her legs. The temperature fell into the 30s. Wind penetrated every opening and found every gap in her clothing. But the straw touching her back, the dense, dry mass of it pressing against her from shoulders to hips, remained noticeably warmer than the exposed blanket on her front. She lay there counting the difference. Cold face, warm back, cold hands, warm shoulders. The straw was not generating heat. Her body was, and the straw was holding it instead of letting the wind carry it away. At dawn, she tested the principle. She filled 2 jars with warm water from her kettle, not boiling, just heated enough to steam. She wrapped one in 12 inches of dry straw, binding it with baling wire so the covering would not shift. The other she set on bare ground beneath an overturned tin pan that blocked the wind but provided no insulation. She checked them after 2 hours. The wrapped jar was still warm enough to steam faintly when she removed the lid. The exposed jar was cold. The difference was not subtle. It was not marginal. The straw had held heat the way a stone wall holds heat, not by producing anything, but by refusing to let it pass. The innovation became clear, and it was not what Theodore or Galen or anyone watching from the settlement fence would have expected. Mabel did not need to warm a normal-sized cabin. She did not need 6 cords of fuel or a stove that could fill a room with heat. She needed to reduce the heated volume to one small chamber, no larger than a bed and a cooking space, and surround it with the thickest available layer of still air trapped between millions of dry wheat stems. She did not need to fight the cold. She needed to make the cold irrelevant. The design formed in her head as she paced around the stack, measuring distances with lengths of baling wire. The chamber would sit inside the 4-post frame, 8 feet by 8 feet at floor level, 6 feet high at the center, sloping toward the walls. 6 to 7 feet of straw on the long sides, 5 feet behind the sleeping wall, 4 to 5 feet above the highest brace. An entrance tunnel approximately 5 feet long, turning once before reaching the room. 2 hanging canvas curtains creating a crude airlock, the first at the outer opening, the second at the inner door. The turn would break the wind's path. The curtains would trap still air between them. A separate clay-lined recess for the lamp stove, insulated from the surrounding straw by packed earth and sheet iron. A low fresh air pipe near the floor. A high exhaust pipe near the ceiling. The flame needed oxygen from outside and had to send its combustion gases outside. Without that circulation, the stove would consume the room's air and replace it with carbon monoxide. She would leave a 3-foot wide pillar of untouched straw in the chamber's center. It would remain there until she understood how the frame carried its load. If the post held, the pillar could come out later. If they did not, the pillar might be the only thing between her and several tons of collapsing roof. She was drawing the entrance angle in the dirt with a stick when Orrin Peak found her. Orrin worked for the Harlan cattle outfit and had stopped at the settlement to water his horse. He was 22 years old, lean from saddle work, and observant in the way that people who spend long days watching cattle learn to be observant, not because they enjoy it, but because a steer that moves wrong costs money. He saw a woman kneeling beside a straw stack with baling wire stretched between her hands, measuring something that was not visible. "You are counting a roof you cannot see," Orrin said. Mabel did not look up. She pulled the wire taut and marked the length against the stick she had used to trace the entrance. "The roof does not need to be visible," she said. "It needs to be square." She showed him what she had found. 2 wires inserted from opposite sides of the stack, angled toward the posts, emerged at equal lengths. The posts formed a rectangle. The frame was symmetrical. Orrin considered this. He was not hostile. He was not dismissive in the way that Galen was dismissive, with the sharpened edge of a man protecting his position. Orrin simply could not understand how a person could sleep beneath 10 tons of straw and expect to wake up. "Cattle lean on stacks," he said. "Wind shifts them. Settlement changes the shape inside where you cannot see it. By January, that frame may be 6 inches lower than it is today." "Then I will know in January," Mabel said. "And if you know because the roof comes down on your head, then I will know that too." Orrin shook his head. He looked at the slot she had cut, the collapsed edge, the torn blanket drying on the ground. He looked at the survival math written in every object around her, the small trunk, the single stove, the jars with their warm water tests still sitting in the straw. "The entrance faces northwest," he said. "The worst wind comes from the north." Mabel paused. He was right. She had cut the exploratory slot where the straw had been easiest to reach, not where the entrance belonged. "Move it to the southeast," Orrin said, "and cut a second exit near the ceiling, fist-sized. If the entrance collapses during a storm, you need another way to breathe." Mabel nodded. She marked the new entrance position on the eastern face. Orrin stood there a moment longer, watching her scratch measurements into the dirt, with the focus of someone who had already decided to live or die by the numbers she was drawing. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a discarded coil of smooth fence wire. "The baling wire will rust through before Christmas," he said. He set the coil on her trunk and mounted his horse. The gift was not acceptance. It was not endorsement of a plan he still believed would kill her. It was the first crack in his certainty. The small, uncomfortable recognition that someone who measures before they cut and listens before they argue might know something that a man on horseback cannot see from the outside. Mabel watched him ride southeast toward the Harlan outfit. Then she picked up the fence wire, tested its strength between her hands, and began cutting the new entrance on the eastern face of the stack. Galen learned about the excavation within 2 days. A settlement boy had watched Mabel carrying armfuls of straw from the eastern side and had told his father, who told the store clerk, who told Galen before the noon meal. Galen told the settlement that Mabel had begun destroying communal livestock feed. He calculated the removed straw at $3 and announced he would add it to her debt. At the general store, the excavation acquired a name. People called it Ives's grave. One farmer predicted rats would drive her out before the first hard frost. Another claimed the first lamp flame she lit inside that pile would be visible from Goodwell, because the whole stack would burn like a bonfire and Mabel Ives with it. The mockery was not cartoonish. It did not come from cruelty. It came from people who had lived through plains winters and understood what straw was: light, flammable, unstable, and temporary. Every objection pointed to a genuine risk. A hollow straw pile could collapse. Wet straw could heat internally and combust. A flame inside a structure made entirely of fuel was an invitation to die. The people laughing at Mabel's grave were not wrong about the dangers. They were wrong only in believing that danger and failure were the same thing. Galen arrived at the stack on the third day with Theodore and 2 ring members. He stood at the new entrance cut and pointed at the freshly exposed straw. "This material belongs to the ring," he said. "Every armful you remove is theft." Mabel reached into the entrance and pulled out a fistful of straw from the exposed interior. She held it under Galen's nose. The stems were dark, slightly warm, and carried a sour smell that anyone who had worked around stored grain would recognize. "This section is heating," she said. "It has been wet for weeks. Feed this to cattle, and you will lose them to colic before you lose them to winter." Galen brushed her hand away. "The condition of the straw is for the ring to assess." Mabel turned to Theodore. "I can show you worse. The northwest shoulder has 600 pounds of material that smells like vinegar. If you leave it in place, it will heat the dry straw around it." Theodore's expression did not change, but he did not dismiss her either. He had managed cattle feed for 30 years. He knew what sour straw meant. Mabel pressed her advantage. She reached beneath her coat and produced a single page, one of the copied ledger sheets. She held it so Theodore could read the column. "September 14th, she said. "Galen charged the ring for 6 gallons of kerosene. The freight agent delivered 4. Galen's face went flat. She copied that page after her dismissal. She could have written anything. "The freight agent's receipt will show 4 gallons, Mabel said. "The freight agent is illiberal and will not return until spring." The confrontation had reached its limit. Mabel had evidence she could not yet prove. Galen had authority she could not yet challenge. Theodore stood between them, with the expression of a man who wished both parties would disappear so he could return to the work of keeping 40 families alive through November. Theodore made a decision that satisfied no one and preserved everything. "The shelter stays," he said, "while the ownership claim is reviewed. But no flame inside until someone experienced inspects the chamber and approves it." He pointed at Mabel. "If that stack collapses or burns, you answer for it." He pointed at Galen. "If you dismantle it before the review, you answer for interfering with a property dispute." Theodore left. The 2 ring members followed. Galen remained. He stepped close to Mabel, close enough that only she could hear, close enough that she could smell the tobacco and grain dust in his coat. "Winter will settle the account before any judge does," he said. He turned and walked back toward the settlement. Mabel stood at the entrance of a half-excavated straw stack with a single page of evidence against a man who controlled the grain scale, the credit ledger, and her mortgage. The sun was going down. The temperature was dropping. Theodore had forbidden the one heat source she possessed. She picked up the hay knife and continued cutting after dark, using moonlight reflected from a tin plate propped against her trunk, rather than lighting the stove. The entrance tunnel took 3 days to complete. Mabel cut into the eastern face at a slight downward angle, following the natural layers of the straw where the mechanical stacker had compressed them into dense horizontal sheets. She learned quickly that cutting parallel to the layers was safer than cutting across them. Parallel cuts separated one sheet from the next without disturbing the mass above. Cross cuts removed support from the overhead straw and invited the same kind of slump that had pinned her on the first day. The tunnel ran 5 feet into the stack before turning north toward the buried frame. The turn was deliberate. Wind entering the tunnel from the southeast would strike the interior wall of the turn and lose most of its force before reaching the chamber. Two curtain positions, one at the outer opening, one at the inner end, would create a dead air space between them. She did not yet have material for the curtains. She had her torn blanket, her canvas bedroll, and the vague hope that something useful might present itself before the first real cold arrived. Inside the tunnel, the temperature difference was immediate. 2 feet from the opening, the air was still and noticeably warmer than outside. At the turn, where the straw surrounded her on all sides, the warmth was palpable. Not comfortable, not room temperature, but a clear and measurable absence of the wind that had been cutting through her clothing since the expulsion. She reached the first post on the 5th day. It was rough-sawn oak, 4 inches square, sunk into the ground, and extending upward into the straw mass above her head. She pressed her palm against it and felt solidity. No rot, no give, no movement when she pushed. The post had been standing inside that straw pile for at least a year, surrounded by material that should have held moisture against the wood and invited decay. But the interior straw was dry. The post was dry. The feeding rack had been built on high ground, and the stacker had piled straw over it during dry weather. The combination had preserved the wood the way a well-sealed barn preserves its frame, by keeping water out and air still. Mabel spent the 6th day mapping the frame. She drove lengths of baling wire through the straw at different heights, feeling for the cross beams she hoped connected the 4 posts. She found 2, one near the top, approximately 6 feet above the ground, and one at waist height. Both ran the width of the frame connecting the posts on the long sides. The frame was rectangular, 8 feet by 8 feet at the posts, with cross beams creating a ceiling that the straw sat upon. The straw above the cross beams was supported not by the compacted mass below it, but by the frame itself. She could excavate below the cross beams without removing the roof support. On the 7th day, she had cleared 1/4 of the chamber. The floor was packed earth, dry, hard, and level. The walls were vertical faces of dense straw, their surfaces smooth where the hay knife had sliced through the compressed stems. The ceiling was invisible above the cross beams, buried under 4 to 5 feet of straw that the frame held in place. The space smelled like summer, like the threshing grounds in August, when the air was thick with dust and the straw flew from the separator in golden sheets. Inside this chamber, surrounded by the material that had defined the last 2 years of her working life, Mabel felt something she had not expected. Not safety, not comfort. Recognition. She knew this material. She had cooked for the men who stacked it, kept the records that tracked its weight, and watched it pile up in mounds so large that children climbed them like hills. She had spent 2 years surrounded by straw and had never once considered that it might keep her alive. Her palms split on the 9th day. The hay knife's handle was wrapped in leather that had dried and cracked years before her father died. The repetitive cutting motion, push, twist, pull, clear, opened blisters that had formed on the 2nd day and split the skin beneath them along lines that followed the tendons from her fingers to her wrist. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from the ruined blanket and kept cutting. By the 10th day, the floor was cleared to the full 8 by 8 dimension, but the chamber was not yet livable. The central pillar of untouched straw still divided the space into 2 narrow aisles. The entrance tunnel had no curtains. The ventilation system did not exist. The stove alcove was not built. And Theodore's prohibition against flame meant that even if she finished the construction, she could not use the one heat source she possessed until someone with experience in straw stack work inspected the chamber and approved it. She needed that inspection. She needed it from someone who understood straw, how it settled, how it heated, how it burned, and how it could be made safe. She did not know that such a person had already heard about her and was walking toward the stack with two damaged fingers on his left hand and a lifetime of knowledge about the material she was trying to turn into a home. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who never tried to understand what you were building? Ansel Wirt arrived on the 11th day. He came on foot from the direction of the settlement road, walking with the deliberate gait of a man who had learned decades ago that hurrying produced mistakes, and mistakes cost fingers. He was missing the last two on his left hand, the ring finger gone above the second knuckle, the small finger gone entirely, taken by a belt accident on a case steam thresher in 1897. The stumps had healed clean and white, and he kept them visible rather than tucked into a glove, the way a man keeps a credential visible. He was 63 years old. His back was straight, his chest narrow, and his eyes moved across the straw stack the way a carpenter's eyes move across a timber frame, cataloging dimensions, assessing loads, reading the surface for signs of what was happening underneath. He stopped at the entrance and looked at the cut. For a long time he said nothing. He walked the full perimeter of the stack, pressing his hand against the surface every few feet, pausing at the corners where the stacker had built the pile highest. He crouched at the base and examined the ground where rainwater would have pooled during the autumn storms. He stood on his toes and looked at the crown, where the outer straw had been bleached white by sun and flattened by its own weight. Then he came back to the entrance and looked at Mabel, who was standing inside the tunnel with the hay knife in her bandaged hands and straw dust powdering her hair. "Who taught you to cut parallel to the layers?" he asked. "No one," Mabel said. "The straw separates easier that way." "And the column in the center, why did you leave it?" "Because I do not know what it is holding." Ansel Wirt looked at the column. He looked at the four posts. He looked at the cross beams above, barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the tunnel entrance. Then he looked at Mabel's hands, the bandaged palms, the split skin visible at the edges of the cloth, the bailing wire cuts on her forearms. "I came because I heard someone was trying to live inside a straw stack," he said. "I expected to find a fool who had dug a hole in the side and crawled in. I did not expect to find someone who had identified the frame, followed the grain, and left a column standing because she did not trust her own certainty." He stepped inside the tunnel. His damaged left hand trailed along the wall, fingertips reading the density of the cut straw the way a blind man reads raised letters. At the turn, he stopped and pressed his shoulder against the inner wall. "This turn breaks the wind," he said. "Did you plan that?" "A cowboy told me to move the entrance to the southeast," Mabel said. "The turn came from the position of the posts." Ansel nodded. "The cowboy was right about the wind. You were right about the posts. Between the two of you, you may have built something that kills you slowly instead of quickly." He was not offering charity. He was not moved by pity for a young woman living in a straw pile. What Ansel Wirt recognized was disciplined work, cuts that followed the material rather than fighting it, a support column preserved out of caution rather than laziness, and hands that had split open and kept cutting. He had spent 40 years building and maintaining straw stacks for threshing operations across 3 states. He had seen men with full crews and proper equipment make worse decisions than the ones Mabel had made alone with a hay knife and 80 feet of wire. "I will teach you what will kill you in here," he said. "Whether you survive after that is your concern." The first lesson was heat, and it nearly ended the partnership before it began. Ansel drove a clean iron rod, 6 feet long, 3/8 of an inch thick, pointed at one end like an oversized knitting needle, into the northwest shoulder of the stack. He pushed it in slowly, letting the rod find its own path through the compressed straw, and left it there with 2 feet protruding. 20 minutes, he said. They waited. Mabel used the time to show him the chamber floor, the mapped post positions, the crossbeam heights she'd measured with wire. Ansel listened without commenting. His attention remained on the iron rod. When he withdrew it, he did not look at it first. He pressed the metal shaft against the inside of his wrist, the soft skin where a nurse would check a pulse, and held it there for 3 seconds. Then he smelled the point. That section is heating, he said. Cool steel does not warm that fast from straw that is merely dry, and dry straw does not smell like turned earth. He drove the rod into a different section, the eastern wall where Mabel had been cutting. He waited again. When he withdrew it, the metal was cool, and the point smelled like nothing at all. Dry, he said. This side is safe. He made her feel the difference. The northwest rod had been warm to the wrist, not hot, not dangerous to touch, but noticeably above the ambient temperature inside the tunnel. The eastern rod was cold. Wet straw feeds bacteria, Ansel said. He did not lecture. He spoke the way a man speaks when describing something he has seen go wrong. The bacteria produce heat. The heat dries the straw nearest to it, which insulates the wet core, which heats further. A well-insulated wet section can reach 160 degrees. At that temperature, the straw itself begins to char without a visible flame. The first sign is a sweet smell, like baking bread. The second sign is smoke. There is no third sign. There is only fire. He pointed at the northwest shoulder. 600 pounds of material in that section needs to come out today, not tomorrow. Today. If you had sealed this chamber and slept in it with that section heating above your head, you might have woken to a fire you could not escape, or you might not have woken at all. Mabel spent the rest of that day removing damp straw from the northwest face. The work was brutal, not because the straw was heavy per armful, but because there were hundreds of armfuls, each one carried through the narrow tunnel and deposited outside where the wind could dry it or carry it away. The removal enlarged a section of wall she had intended to preserve as insulation. By evening, the northwest corner was thinner than the others, 5 feet of straw instead of 7. Ansel inspected the gap and shook his head. Acceptable, he said. A thinner wall that is dry will outperform a thick wall that is cooking itself. The second lesson was load, and it required patience that Mabel did not yet possess. Ansel tied threads from each of the 4 frame posts to small bells. Not actual bells, but spoons suspended over a tin pan so that any movement would produce a metallic click audible from the sleeping area. If the roof settled, the threads would pull. If the threads pulled, the spoons would strike. If the spoons struck, Mabel would know that the structure was moving before the movement became a collapse. You will hear these in your sleep, Ansel said. That is the point. He watched Mabel remove straw from the chamber walls and corrected her method. She had been stripping one wall completely before moving to the next, excavating in long vertical cuts that exposed the interior in clean slabs. The result was efficient but dangerous. A fully stripped wall transferred its share of the overhead load to the remaining walls and to the frame. If one side was cleared while the opposite side remained packed, the load became asymmetric. Asymmetric loads twisted frames. Alternate, Ansel said. Take a pocket from the north wall, then a pocket from the south, then east, then west. Let the stack adjust in small increments. If you hear a spoon, stop and wait for the movement to finish before you cut again. Mabel followed his instructions. The work slowed to half its former pace. She would cut a section the size of a flour barrel from one wall, carry the straw outside, return, and cut the same volume from the opposite wall. Between each pair of cuts, she paused and listened to the spoons. On the 14th day, the spoons clicked. Mabel froze. The sound was small, a single tap of tin against tin, but it meant that somewhere above her, the compressed mass of straw had shifted. She waited 10 minutes. No second click came. She reached up and checked the thread on the nearest post. It was taut, but unbroken. The settlement had been less than an inch. She learned to read those clicks the way a sailor reads the sounds of a ship's hull. One click meant normal adjustment, the stack compressing into the space she had removed. 2 clicks in rapid succession meant accelerated movement. 3 or more meant danger, and she was to leave the chamber immediately and inspect the exterior for visible sagging. In 3 weeks of cutting, the spoons clicked more than 40 times. Only once did Mabel hear 3 clicks in a row. That night she slept in the entrance tunnel rather than the chamber. By morning, the movement had stopped. The roof had settled 2.5 inches across its full span. Ansel inspected the posts and found them still vertical, the crossbeams still level. The frame had held, but the settlement warning was real. 2.5 inches over 3 weeks meant the roof would continue to drop as moisture left the straw and the compressed mass found its new equilibrium. Mabel needed internal bracing that would slow the settlement and distribute the load more evenly across the frame. She and Ansel spent 2 days building ribs. They wire-bound dense straw into bundles 6 inches thick and 4 feet long, tight enough to resist compression, flexible enough to wedge between the posts without splitting. These bundles fit vertically between the floor and the crossbeams, pressing upward against the roof straw and transferring part of the overhead weight directly to the ground. 12 ribs. Each one took an hour to bind, position, and secure. Mabel's hands bled through the bandages by the 4th rib. Ansel tied the wire for the remaining 8, using his 3 good fingers and the stumps of the missing 2 with a dexterity that made Mabel stop and watch. "You're staring at my hand," Ansel said. "I'm staring at your knots," Mabel said. Ansel almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen his expression change from the careful neutrality of a man who evaluated everything and approved of nothing. The central pillar shrank as the ribs went in. With 12 braces supplementing the frame, the pillar no longer carried sole responsibility for supporting the center of the roof. Mabel cut it from 3 feet across to 18 inches. Ansel stopped her there. "The ribs support the edges," he said. "The center is the longest span. 18 inches stays until I am satisfied the frame will not bow." The pillar remained. The chamber was livable but divided. 2 narrow aisles flanking an obstruction that made the space feel like a corridor rather than a room. The 3rd lesson was air and fire, and it was the one Theodore had forbidden. Ansel lit a candle wick and immediately blew it out. The thin line of smoke rose vertically from the extinguished wick, curling upward toward the ceiling. He held it at waist height, then at knee height, then at the floor. At each level, the smoke behaved differently, rising fast near the ceiling where warmth collected, drifting slowly near the floor where cooler air pooled. "Warm air rises," Ansel said. "You know that. What you may not know is that a single opening does not create circulation. It creates pressure. If you put one hole in the roof, warm air pushes out and nothing replaces it. The chamber depressurizes and draws air through every crack in the straw, uncontrolled, unfiltered, carrying moisture and cold from whatever direction the wind decides." He held the smoking wick near the entrance tunnel. The smoke moved inward. The chamber was drawing air from outside through the only available opening. "2 paths," he said. "One low, one high. Cool air enters low because it is heavy. Warm air exits high because it is light. The circulation is constant, controlled, and directional. The flame gets oxygen from below and sends its poison out above. They built the ventilation system over 3 days using materials scavenged from the settlement's refuse pile and donated grudgingly by Orrin Peak, who had returned with 4 flour sacks, a broken stove damper, and a small mercury thermometer. The low intake was 2 sections of salvaged stovepipe, each 18 inches long, fitted together and angled slightly downward from the exterior to prevent rain from entering. It emerged inside the chamber 6 inches above the floor near the planned stove alcove. The high exhaust was a longer assembly, 3 pipe sections joined with wire that rose from the ceiling of the chamber through the straw mass and emerged above the curved surface of the stack. A pivoting exterior cap made from the broken damper and a strip of tin allowed Mabel to close the exhaust during heavy rain or turn it away from the prevailing wind. Between the 2 vents, Ansel installed a small observation flap, a square of canvas on a wire hinge that allowed Mabel to check whether smoke traveled outward through the high exhaust or backed into the chamber. The stove alcove itself was the most careful piece of construction in the entire shelter. Mabel cleared a recess 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep in the eastern wall, at the point farthest from the sleeping area. She packed the bottom with earth, carried in from outside, compressed and leveled to rise, and laid a sheet of salvaged iron on top. More earth filled the gaps between the iron and the straw walls. Ansel mixed clay from a creek bed with sand and daubed it over the nearest straw surfaces, building a heat shield that separated the flame from the fuel by 4 inches of mineral material. 2 water buckets stood beside the alcove. The buckets were not optional. They were the condition under which Ansel would permit any flame test at all. "The clay will crack," he said. "The iron will warp. The straw behind the shield will dry until it is lighter than paper. If a spark crosses that gap, you have seconds to contain it. Water beside the flame, always, every time. If you cannot reach the bucket from where you sit, the bucket is in the wrong place." The first test came on day 19. Mabel placed the lamp stove on the iron tray, adjusted the wick to its lowest setting, and lit it with a match. The flame was small, barely large enough to heat a pan, and it burned yellow with a faint blue edge at the base. Ansel watched the smoke from the observation flap. It did not move outward. It did not move at all. The exhaust was dead. "Kill it," he said. Mabel extinguished the flame. Ansel went outside and examined the high exhaust cap. The wind was blowing directly into the pipe opening, forcing air downward and preventing the warm exhaust from rising. "The cap must face away from the wind," Mabel said. "The wind changes direction," Ansel replied. "A fixed cap works only when the wind agrees with it." Mabel climbed the exterior of the stack carefully, distributing her weight across a plank laid flat against the surface, and repositioned the cap at a steeper angle. She extended the exhaust pipe 6 inches above the curved stack surface so the wind would pass over the opening rather than into it. The second test drew correctly. The observation flap showed a steady movement of air outward through the high exhaust. The flame burned cleanly. The smoke test confirmed that combustion gases were leaving the chamber. Ansel allowed the flame to burn for 3 minutes. He checked the straw behind the iron shield. It was warm, 81 degrees on the mercury thermometer, but not hot. The clay daub was intact. The water buckets were full and within arm's reach. 3 minutes, he said. Tomorrow, 5. The day after, 10. You will increase the burn time by 2 minutes per day until I'm satisfied that the shield holds and the vents function under sustained use. If at any point the straw behind the shield exceeds 100 degrees, you will extinguish the flame and we will rebuild the alcove. Mabel was learning patience not as a virtue, but as a survival requirement. Every shortcut she might take a longer burn, a higher wick, a faster construction pace, carried a consequence measured not in inconvenience, but in fire, collapse, or suffocation. Ansel did not teach through warnings. He taught through controlled exposure to the specific conditions that would kill her if she ignored them. By day 21, the flame had been tested for 20 consecutive minutes without the straw temperature exceeding 91 degrees. The chamber, sealed with both curtains, which Mabel and Orrin had sewn from the 4 flour sacks during an awkward work-centered evening that involved no conversation except measurements and needle requests, held heat measurably. The thermometer at the center of the room rose from 46 degrees to 57 degrees during a 1-hour burn on a day when the outside temperature was 31. Only the central pillar and the second entrance curtain remained to be completed, and the weather was changing. Galen had not been idle during the construction weeks. On day 16, 2 men from the settlement arrived at the north face of the stack carrying hay forks. They said Galen had sent them to remove bedding straw for the cattle pens. The north face was the side where Ansel had identified the overheated section, and Mabel had removed 600 pounds of damp material. The remaining straw on that face was dry and structurally critical. It provided lateral support for the frame and insulated the chamber wall that faced the prevailing winter wind. The men drove their forks into the face and pulled. The first forkful came free, cleanly. The second shifted a section of the interior wall. Inside the chamber, one of Mabel's wire-tied ribs pulled loose from its position and swung sideways. The crossbeam above it groaned. Mabel came through the entrance tunnel at a run. She held the iron testing rod in her right hand, not as a weapon, but because she had been using it when she heard the fork striking the exterior. The rod was 3 feet long and hot from the sun. She planted herself between the men and the stack face. "Pull from that face, and you may kill me before winter has the chance," she said. The men looked at the rod. They looked at Mabel, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 93 pounds lighter than either of them, her hands wrapped in stained cloth, straw dust in her hair and on her eyelids. One of them stepped back. The other looked toward the settlement road, where Galen stood beside a wagon watching. "The stack belongs to the ring," one of the men said. Ansel's voice came from behind Mabel. He had approached from the southern side, where he had been checking the low intake vent. "Show me which section Galen chose," Ansel said. The men pointed at the area they had been forking. Ansel walked to it, pressed his palm against the face, and drove the iron rod into the stack at shoulder height. He left it for 2 minutes, then withdrew it and pressed it against the inside of his wrist. "This section is dry and structurally sound," he said. "The only section on this face that contained heat-damaged straw was removed 2 weeks ago by Mabel. Galen has chosen the one area that serves no practical bedding purpose and provides maximum structural support to the interior chamber." He turned to face the men directly. "If Galen wanted cattle bedding, the southeast corner has 2 tons of loose surface straw that could be forked without touching the shelter. He did not send you for bedding. He sent you for damage." The men did not argue. They carried their forks back toward the settlement. Within an hour, Theodore arrived. He inspected the partial collapse, the displaced rib, the stressed crossbeam, the fresh fork marks on the north face. He pressed his hand against the wall where Ansel had tested with the rod. He looked at the straw Mabel had removed from the overheated section, still drying in a pile 30 yards away. "Galen takes no more straw from the north face," Theodore said. "If he needs bedding, he can fork the southeast corner." It was not an endorsement. Theodore still believed the shelter was dangerous, but he was beginning to see a distinction between danger that Mabel was addressing and danger that Galen was creating. Mabel re-entered the chamber and retied the displaced rib. The cross beam had shifted less than half an inch. The spoon alarm had clicked 3 times during the forking, the same 3-click warning that had sent her sleeping in the tunnel 2 weeks earlier. She reinforced the north wall with 2 additional ribs and added a cross wire between the nearest posts. The repair took the rest of the day. The construction timeline had lost 12 hours to damage that should never have occurred. 24 days had passed since the expulsion. 3 days remained until November, and the morning of day 25 brought air that smelled wrong. Ansel and Mabel transferred the central pillar's load on day 26. They built 2 wire-bound arches from the densest straw bundles Mabel could produce, each one curved like the rib of a boat, pressed upward against the ceiling straw and anchored to the frame posts on either side. The arches crossed the 8-foot span at the chamber's center, replacing the compressive strength of the pillar with tensile strength distributed across the frame. Mabel cut the pillar from the top down. Each section she removed reduced the support beneath the ceiling and transferred weight onto the arches and the frame. After each cut, she waited and listened. The spoons clicked once, twice, 3 times. She stopped. Ansel checked the arches. The wire had stretched slightly under the new load, but the straw bundles had compressed to absorb it. He tightened the wire and nodded. Mabel cut the next section. 2 clicks. She waited. Silence. The final section came free in her hands, a cylinder of compressed straw 18 inches across and 2 feet tall, warm from the body heat and kerosene warmth that had been absorbing for 3 weeks. She set it against the wall. The roof held. The completed floor measured 8 feet by 8 feet. The full 6-foot height existed only through the center, where the cross beams ran between the posts. The ceiling sloped toward the walls, dropping to 4.5 feet at the edges. A person could stand upright in the middle and sit comfortably against any wall. The sleeping area occupied the western side. A suspended bedroll hung between 2 posts at hip height, keeping the sleeper off the cold ground and allowing air to circulate beneath. The stove alcove glowed faintly in the eastern wall, its clay-daubed surfaces darkened from the test burns. The 2 ventilation pipes were invisible inside the straw mass, their presence marked only by the observation flap and the slight movement of air near the low intake. The entrance tunnel turned once, the flour sack curtains hanging at each end. The mercury thermometer hung from a nail driven into the nearest post. During the first full test night, with the curtains closed and no flame burning, it read 46 degrees when the outside temperature was 29. That was body heat alone. Mabel's 98.6 degrees radiating into a small sealed space insulated by several feet of dry straw on every side. She lit the lamp stove on its lowest setting. After 1 hour, the thermometer read 57 degrees. The straw behind the heat shield read 81. The observation flap showed a clean outward draft. At dawn, the center thermometer read 53 degrees. The sleeping wall read 51. The outside temperature had dropped to 26 overnight. 27 degrees of difference. No fuel except a single lamp stove wick burning at its lowest setting for 1 hour. No timber, no stone, no framed walls. Just straw, air, wire, iron, clay, and the physics of still air refusing to carry heat. Ansel did not celebrate. He inspected every surface, checked every vent, pressed his wrist against every wall section. He studied the thermometer readings and shook his head. The air was calm, he said. No snow on the vents. No one opened the door repeatedly. No wind drove rain against the face. You have proven that the chamber works when nothing is trying to break it. That is not survival. That is a demonstration. Theodore arrived that morning and entered the chamber for the first time. He moved slowly, ducking under the cross beam at the entrance, running his hand along the ribbed walls, pressing his boot against the packed earth floor. He checked the thermometer. He examined the stove alcove, the clay, the iron, the earth beneath, the distance between the flame position and the nearest straw surface. He placed his hand against the straw behind the heat shield. 81 degrees. He held it there for several seconds. Your wall is fuel, he said. Your roof is fuel. Your bed is fuel. That is why the burner sits on earth inside iron and clay rather than against straw, Mabel replied. Theodore did not answer. He looked at the ventilation flap, the water buckets, the spoon alarms. He looked at the thermometer again, 53 degrees at dawn, without the stove running, when the outside air was 26. He left without endorsing the shelter, but he did not forbid the flame. The morning of November's 11th began strangely warm. By 9 o'clock, the thermometer outside the stack read 68 degrees. By 10, it had passed 70. Horses in the settlement sweated under winter coats that had been appropriate the day before. The southern air was damp, and it carried a smell that Mabel could not place. Metallic, heavy, like the air before a summer thunderstorm, but without the electricity. By noon, the temperature reached the upper 70s. A man at the settlement store removed his coat, then his vest. Children ran barefoot. Someone joked that October had come back to apologize for November. Ansel was not laughing. He had arrived at the stack before dawn to check the vent caps after a night of intermittent wind, and he had not left. He stood on the southern side of the stack and stared northwest, where the sky met the flat horizon in a line so sharp it looked drawn with a ruler. The line was blue-black, not cloud-dark, not rain-dark, a color that did not belong in the sky above a day that felt like late summer. Fill both water buckets, Ansel said. Clear each vent. Tie the exterior rope belts. Cook whatever you plan to eat tonight and do it now, because you will not want the flame running when that arrives. Mabel looked at the horizon. The blue-black line had not moved. It sat there like a wall. What is it? She asked. The end of the warm air, Ansel said. When it comes, it will come fast. He helped her tighten the rope belts, 3 lines of heavy cord that circled the stack at different heights, preventing the straw from spreading outward under its own weight or the pressure of wind against the face. He checked the vent caps, adjusted the high exhaust to face southeast, and closed the observation flap. Then he looked at the widow's roof 3 miles north. She had 2 children and a frame house with a chimney that Ansel had helped repair in September. The flashing around the base was loose. In moderate wind, it would hold. In what was coming, it would peel back and expose the interior to rain, then sleet, then snow. I must go, he said. Mabel understood. She did not ask him to stay. She did not ask him to choose between her shelter and the widow's children. She had the chamber, the stove, the vents, the alarms, and every lesson he had given her. The widow had a loose chimney flashing and no one else. Ansel left at 1:15 in the afternoon. The temperature was still above 70. The blue-black line had begun to move. Mabel must face the first real test of the straw chamber without the man who had taught her how to build it. She cooked rabbit in the shallow pan, a rabbit she had snared 2 days earlier and saved for exactly the kind of day when cooking might become impossible. The lamp stove heated the fat until it hissed. The chamber smelled like food. The thermometer read 61 degrees with the flame running and both curtains closed. She turned the wick down, covered the pan, and waited. At 2 o'clock, the wind shifted. The change was not gradual. It did not build from a breeze into a gust into a gale over the course of an hour. It arrived as a wall. One moment the air was still and warm, and the straw on the stacked surface barely moved. The next moment, the entire southern sky disappeared behind a curtain of dust that turned the daylight the color of old coffee. The dust became rain. The rain became sleet. The sleet drove sideways against the stack with a sound like gravel thrown against canvas. Inside the chamber, Mabel heard it. The straw walls absorbed most of the impact, but the entrance tunnel acted as a sound channel, funneling the roar of the wind inward until the curtains bulged. The outer curtain, the flour sack panel she and Orrin had sewn, snapped against its wire frame with a crack that sounded like a branch breaking. She tied the curtain's lower edge to a stake driven into the tunnel floor. The snapping stopped. The curtain held. The thermometer outside, which Mabel could not see but which the settlement would later report, fell 36 degrees during the first hour. 78 became 42. The sleet became snow. The wind did not diminish. It increased, driving the snow horizontally across the flat, treeless Panhandle with nothing to slow it between the Kansas border and the Red River. Inside the chamber, the thermometer dropped from 61 to 58, 3 degrees, 1 hour, while the outside air had fallen 36. The outer weathered straw shed much of the first moisture. The stack's compressed surface acted like a thatched roof. The rain and sleet ran down the outer stems without penetrating to the dry interior. Water pooled at the base, but the chamber floor sat 4 inches above ground level on packed earth, and the entrance tunnel angled slightly downward from the interior, draining any seepage outward. The spoon alarms rang twice as the stack compressed under the changing pressure. The first ring was a single click, normal settlement. The second was 2 clicks in rapid succession. Mabel stood beneath the crossbeam and placed both hands on the nearest rib. She could feel the pressure, a slow, even compression, as the wind pushed against the north face and the weight of accumulating snow pressed downward on the crown. She checked the wire tension on each rib. 2 had loosened. She retightened them with the pliers Ansel had left, wrapping the wire around itself in the 3-turn twist he had shown her. The spoons went silent. By 5 o'clock, the temperature outside had fallen into the 20s. Inside the chamber, with both curtains closed and the lamp stove extinguished since the cooking, the thermometer read 56 degrees, body heat alone. The straw walls were doing what Mabel's father had shown her in the potato pit 15 years ago, trapping still air in millions of tiny pockets between the stems and refusing to let the cold pass through. She sat in the near dark, with the pan of cooked rabbit beside her, and listened to the storm trying to disassemble the world outside. Orrin Peake left the Harlan outfit at 4:30 in the afternoon, 2 hours after the front arrived. At the bunkhouse, Galen had come to collect a debt from one of the hands and had stayed when the storm made travel dangerous. He stood by the stove with his back to the fire and told anyone listening that the girl in the straw pile had no chance. "The wind will strip the north face by midnight," he said. "By morning there will be nothing left but posts and a frozen body." Theodore had ordered no one to ride in the whiteout. The trail between the Harlan outfit and Mabel's stack crossed 3 miles of open plain with no windbreak, no fence line to follow, and no landmark visible in blowing snow. A man who lost direction in that crossing would ride in circles until his horse stopped, and they both froze. Orrin did not argue with the order. He saddled his horse, checked the cinch, and rode north without telling anyone. He rode because of the mitten. Mabel's mitten, hand-knitted gray wool, mended twice at the thumb, hung from a wagon stake near the settlement road. She had lost it 3 days earlier while carrying straw. Orrin had seen it that morning and had meant to return it. He had not. And now the temperature was below 30 and falling. The wind was driving snow sideways at 40 miles an hour, and he could not stop thinking about a woman with 1 mitten and no stove trying to survive inside 10 tons of straw. He expected to find her body beside the stack. He was riding out to bring it back. The horse lasted 2 miles before refusing to face the wind. Orrin dismounted and led it by the bridle, leaning into the gale with his hat pulled to his eyebrows and his scarf wrapped twice around his face. The snow was not falling, it was flying. It moved horizontally, stinging every exposed surface, building drifts against anything that interrupted its path. He found the stack by walking into it. His forehead struck the eastern face and he staggered back, disoriented, before realizing that the dark mass in front of him was not a hill, but the straw pile he had been searching for. He tied the horse to the rope belt on the south side, where the stack blocked the worst of the wind, and worked his way around to the entrance. Mabel's tracks ended against a solid wall of straw. The entrance was sealed, not collapsed, but deliberately plugged with a bundle of loose straw held in place by a stake. He pulled the stake free, removed the plug, and pushed through the outer curtain. The wind stopped. The silence was so abrupt that Oren's ears rang. He stood in the entrance tunnel, where the turn broke the wind's path, and heard nothing but his own breathing and the muffled roar of the storm passing over the stack above him. He pushed through the inner curtain and stepped into the chamber. Golden lamplight. The single-burner stove sat in its alcove, flame adjusted low, casting a warm circle across the flour sack walls and the packed earth floor. The air was warm, not tepid, not merely above freezing. Warm. The kind of warmth that enters through clothing and loosens muscles that have been clenched against cold for hours. Mabel sat in shirtsleeves beside the stove, turning pieces of rabbit in the shallow pan. The mercury thermometer on the post read 62 degrees. Near the burner, where the heat radiated from the iron tray, it read 68. She was not celebrating. She was not relieved. She was watching the observation flap, checking that the exhaust was still drawing correctly, monitoring the flame's color for any sign that the draft had reversed. Oren stood in the entrance with sleet melting from his eyebrows and ice cracking from the creases of his coat. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the pan. He looked at the woman in shirt sleeves cooking meat inside a pile of straw, while the worst storm in memory tried to erase everything that was not nailed down or buried. He started laughing. The laughter was not amusement. It was the involuntary release of a man whose body had been preparing for death, not his own, but hers, and had found life instead. The laughter shook him, and then the shivering began, and the shivering did not stop. Mabel recognized early exposure. She had seen it in men who worked too long in cold rain during threshing season, the uncontrolled shaking, the confusion, the hands that could not grip. She stood, took his frozen coat from his shoulders, and hung it near the high exhaust, where the rising warm air would dry it without bringing it near the flame. She wrapped him in the dry portion of her blanket, the half that had survived the first day collapse, and pressed a cup of warm water into his hands. "Not hot," she said. "Warm. Drink it slowly." She added a spoonful of molasses to the cup, sugar and warmth, the two things a cold body needed before it needed anything else. Oren drank. His hand shook so badly that water ran down his chin and into the blanket. He did not notice. He was staring at the thermometer. 62 degrees, he said. 62 at the center, Mabel said. 58 near the sleeping wall. 68 near the burner. Choose where you want to sit. The expected rescuer had become the person rescued. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the shelter's greatest strength has just become its most dangerous weakness. The exhaust failed at 9 o'clock. Mabel noticed the change in the flame before she noticed anything else. The lamp stove's wick had been burning with a clean yellow light edged in blue for 7 consecutive hours. Now the blue edge disappeared. The flame elongated, turned a dirty orange, and began producing a thin line of soot that deposited itself on the bottom of the cooking pan. She checked the observation flap. No movement. The exhaust was dead. Snow and loose chaff had clogged the high vent where it emerged from the stack's surface. The cap, which Ansel had positioned to face southeast away from the prevailing north wind, had apparently collected snow on its leeward side, packed there by eddies that swirled over the stack's crown and deposited their load on every available surface. Without the exhaust, combustion gases had no exit. Carbon monoxide, odorless, invisible, was accumulating in the chamber. The dirty flame was the warning. The soot was the proof. The stove was burning its own exhaust rather than fresh air. Mabel extinguished the flame immediately. The chamber went dark, except for the faint gray light that filtered through the observation flap. Temperature began to drop. Without the stove, the room's heat came only from two human bodies, Mabel and Orrin, radiating into an insulated space that was now also sealed. Within 20 minutes, the thermometer fell from 62 to 58 degrees, then 56, then 54. Orrin sat up from the blanket. His shivering had stopped, but his hands were still clumsy, and his voice was hoarse. "Open the exterior vent," he said. "Clear the cap." "If I go outside, the wind may tear the cap away entirely," Mabel said. "Then we have a 6-inch hole in the roof with no cover, and snow enters the chamber directly. If you do not clear the vent, we breathe our own poison." They stared at each other across the dark room. Both arguments were correct. Both solutions carried risks that might be worse than the problem. Mabel remembered Ansel's voice. Not the words of any specific lesson, but the principle beneath all of them. Test before you commit. Find the information before you make the decision. She lit a match and held it near the observation flap. The flame bent inward. The chamber was drawing air from the high vent, not pushing it out. The blockage was creating a reverse draft. Outside air was entering through the exhaust and exiting through the low intake, backwards. The circulation had inverted. She did not need to go outside. She needed to break the blockage from inside. She found the coil of smooth fence wire that Orrin had given her weeks ago, the same wire that had replaced the rusting baling wire on her earliest braces. She straightened a 4-foot length and threaded it through the observation flap into the high exhaust pipe. The wire met resistance almost immediately. Compressed snow and chaff packed into the pipe like a cork. She pushed. The wire bent. She twisted it, creating a corkscrew pattern at the tip, and pushed again. The resistance gave slightly. She withdrew the wire, cleared the debris that clung to the twisted end, and pushed it through a third time. A gust of cold air struck her face through the observation flap. The blockage had broken. She could hear the wind whistling across the now clear pipe opening. She held the match near the flap again. The flame bent outward. The draft had reversed to its correct direction. Warm air rising, cool air entering low. She did not relight the stove. She performed Ansel's smoke test first. She lit the candle wick, blew it out, and held the smoking tip at the low intake, at the center of the room, and at the high exhaust. At each point, the smoke moved correctly, inward at the floor, upward at the center, outward at the ceiling. Only then did she relight the lamp stove. The flame burned clean, yellow with a blue edge, no soot. The observation flap showed a steady outward draft. The temperature began climbing. 54 became 56. 56 became 58. At 11 o'clock, they heard metal striking the ground. The sound came through the low intake vent, a rhythmic banging, like a hammer on an anvil, but irregular. Mabel pressed her ear to the pipe. Wind, snow, and beneath both, the unmistakable sound of something heavy striking frozen earth. Orrin heard it too. "Wagon," he said. "Overturn. The tongue is hitting the ground." 50 yards away, invisible in the whiteout, a settlement wagon had left the road. It had struck a shallow gully, broken its front axle, and tipped onto its left side. The horses had broken free and run. Beneath the wagon tongue, pinned across the hips by the iron-bound wood, lay Wilmer Doss. Wilmer was 16 years old. He had been driving supplies from Goodwell to the settlement and had been caught in the open when the front arrived. He was conscious but confused. His left boot was missing. His foot was white. They did not find him immediately. Orrin wanted to search the moment he heard the sound. Mabel made him wait. "Your hands," she said. "Close them." Orrin tried. His fingers bent halfway and stopped. The fine motor control had not returned from his own exposure. If he went into the storm without the ability to grip, he would not be able to lift a wagon tongue or carry a person. Mabel opened both curtains and entered the entrance tunnel. The temperature difference hit her like walking into a wall. The sheltered interior of the stack gave way to a tunnel of moving air, and the outer opening gave way to a world that no longer contained directions. The snow was horizontal. The wind was a physical force pressing against her chest. The temperature was somewhere near 15 degrees and falling. She tied a rope between the frame post nearest the entrance and Orrin's waist. 40 feet of line. If he walked 40 feet in any direction and found nothing, he would follow the rope back. He would not disappear into the whiteout the way men disappeared every winter on the open plains, walking in circles, their tracks filling behind them, their bodies found in the spring less than 100 yards from shelter. Orrin found the wagon at 32 feet. The tongue was still striking the ground where the wind rocked the overturned bed. Wilmer lay beneath it, his coat pulled over his head, his bare foot buried in the snow. Orrin could not lift the tongue alone. His hands would not grip the iron ring. Mabel came out on the rope, and together they levered the tongue sideways, using the hay knife as a pry bar. Wilmer rolled free. He could not stand. They dragged him into the entrance tunnel on the canvas bedroll. Mabel pulled the straw plug into the outer opening. Orrin pulled through the inner curtain. Wilmer lay between them on the tunnel floor, conscious but unable to answer questions. Opening both curtains dropped the chamber temperature from 58 to 48 degrees. The cold air that entered during the rescue filled the lower half of the room and pushed the warm air upward against the ceiling where it could not reach the occupants. Mabel closed both curtains. She hung Wilmer's wet coat near the exhaust, not near the flame, and removed his remaining boot. Both feet were cold. The left foot was white at the toes. She did not rub it. She wrapped it in the dry blanket and placed it near, not against, the warm stove tray. She heated broth from the remaining rabbit fat and bean liquid and held the cup to Wilmer's mouth. He drank without understanding what he was drinking. 3 people now occupied a chamber designed for one. The additional body heat was measurable. 2 more sources of 98.6 degrees radiating into an insulated space. But the wet clothing, the repeated door openings, and the cold air trapped in the lower room overwhelmed the gain. The thermometer climbed slowly. 48, 50, 52. 3 people breathing in a sealed space. 3 people consuming oxygen. 3 people producing carbon dioxide and moisture. The observation flap showed a steady draft. The vents were functioning, but the load had changed. The chamber was not designed for 3 occupants producing heat, consuming air, and exhaling moisture at 3 times the intended rate. Condensation appeared on the interior straw surface nearest the exhaust. Water droplets formed where warm, moist air contacted the cooler straw and surrendered its moisture. The drops ran down the wall and pooled on the floor. Mabel wiped the wall with a flour sack and pressed dry straw against the wet surface. She would need to repeat this every few hours. Ansel had not taught her this specific problem because they had never tested the chamber with multiple occupants. but the principle was the same. Moisture in the straw meant heat in the straw, and heat in the straw meant danger. Outside, the storm continued. The thermometer at the settlement read 17 degrees at midnight and continued falling. Inside the bunkhouse at the Harlan outfit, the stove was burning at full capacity, but wind forced smoke down the chimney. Theodore ordered the fire extinguished. Cracks around the frame walls drew heat outward into the gale. Wash water froze in a basin along the north wall of the room. Galen's grain office lost part of its roof at 11:30. The tin peeled back like a page being turned, and sleet entered the gap and soaked the desk, the shelves, and the locked cabinet where he kept his ledgers. The ink ran. The paper swelled. The figures that Mabel had copied and Galen had altered began dissolving into the wet pulp of their pages. At 2 in the morning, the north face of the straw stack lost several feet of loose outer material. The wind had been eroding the weathered surface for hours, pulling strands free and carrying them into the dark. The loss thinned the insulating wall on the most exposed side. One of the spoon alarms began striking continuously. Not clicks, a steady ringing, as if someone were tapping the pan with a spoon in a regular rhythm. A brace wire had stretched under the changed load distribution, and the post it was tied to had shifted. Not collapsing, but tilting inward as the lateral support from the north wall diminished. Mabel and Orrin could not reach the exterior in the wind. The repair had to happen from inside. Mabel found the stretched wire by touch, running her hands along each brace until she felt the one that had gone slack. She tightened the interior cross wire around the 2 nearest posts, pulling the tilted posts back toward vertical. Then she took the straw from the removed central pillar, which she had saved and stored against the southern wall, and packed it beneath the sagging rib on the north side. The work was done in near darkness. The lamp stove sat in its alcove, flame at its lowest setting, providing just enough light to cast shadows on the flour sack walls. Orrin held the wire while Mabel twisted. Wilmer slept beneath 2 coats, his breathing steady, his color improving. Mabel was applying every lesson Ansel had given her, and she was applying them simultaneously, identifying settlement before it became failure, transferring load rather than pushing blindly upward, protecting airflow while closing drafts, keeping the stove extinguished whenever the structure was being disturbed. She had relighted the stove only after the repair was complete. The wire was tight, and the spoon had stopped striking. The sag stopped at 7 inches. The alarm went silent. By dawn, the world outside was white and still. The wind had dropped. The temperature at the settlement read 14 degrees. Snow covered every surface to a depth of 9 inches, with drifts of 4 and 5 feet against every vertical face. Inside Mabel's chamber, center thermometer, 58 degrees. Sleeping wall, 55 degrees. Straw behind the heat shield, 84 degrees. Roof settlement, 7 inches total, no continuing movement. 3 people lay on the packed earth floor in the suspended bedroll, exhausted, damp from condensation and dried sweat, but alive and responsive. The lamp stove burned at its lowest setting. The observation flap showed a clean draft. The water buckets were half empty, used for drinking, for broth, for wiping condensation from the walls. Outside, 14 degrees and silence. Inside, 58 degrees and the smell of rabbit fat and kerosene and dry straw, and 3 people who had been alive all night in a room made of the material the wind had tried to use against them. The innovation had not proved itself by reaching a magical temperature. It had proved itself by maintaining a survivable, controllable environment, imperfect, demanding, dangerous in its own right, while exposed frame buildings became unlivable and a man who had ridden out expecting to collect a body sat wrapped in a torn blanket, eating broth. Theodore arrived after sunrise, with Ansel and 2 men carrying shovels. They had walked 3 miles from the settlement through drifts that reached their thighs, following the road by memory because the road itself had disappeared under 9 inches of snow and 4-foot drifts that erased every fence post, every wagon rut, every landmark between the settlement buildings and the straw stack standing alone on the open plain. Theodore expected to find a collapse. He had spent the night in the settlement bunkhouse with the stove extinguished and ice forming on the interior walls, and he had calculated the odds of a straw shelter surviving winds that had peeled tin from Galen's grain office and driven snow through frame walls built by men who knew what they were doing. The odds, by his experience, were not good. Ansel expected to find Mabel alive. He did not say so. He had spent the night repairing the widow's chimney flashing while her children slept in the kitchen beside a stove he had kept running by blocking the downdraft with a wet horse blanket draped across the chimney throat. His hands were blistered from holding sheet metal against wind that tried to rip it from his grip. His coat was soaked. He was 63 years old, and he had not slept. But he had built the bracing inside that stack. He had tested the vents, the shield, the clay daub, the wire ties. He had watched Mabel retighten every connection he loosened and check every reading he questioned. He knew the chamber's weaknesses because he had identified them, and he knew Mabel had addressed each one because he had watched her do it. The 2 men with shovels were there to dig a body from a collapsed straw pile. They carried the shovels the way pallbearers carry their tools, with the quiet certainty of men performing a necessary task. Mabel opened the outer curtain in shirt sleeves. The men with shovels stopped walking. Theodore stood in the snow and looked at her. Straw dust in her hair, dark circles beneath her eyes, bandaged hands, and behind her, through the tunnel entrance, the faint golden light of the lamp stove reflecting from flour sack walls. "How many inside?" Theodore asked. 3, Mabel said. "Orrin Peake and Wilmer Doss. Wilmer has frostbite on his left foot. Orrin was hypothermic when he arrived, but has recovered." Theodore entered the tunnel. Ansel followed. The 2 men with shovels remained outside, uncertain what to do with tools designed for a task that no longer existed. Inside the chamber, Theodore moved slowly. He checked the thermometer first. 56 degrees, lower than the overnight reading because Mabel had opened both curtains to admit the rescue party. He pressed his hand against each wall section. He examined the north side, where the exterior straw loss had thinned the insulation, and the interior repair had redistributed the load. He checked the brace wires, the ribs, the crossbeam connections. He found the 7-inch settlement mark on the nearest post, a line Mabel had scratched with a nail to track the roof's descent. He crouched beside the stove alcove and placed his hand on the clay daub behind the iron shield. 84 degrees. He held his hand there for 10 seconds, feeling the heat that had been radiating through the shield for 12 hours without igniting the straw behind it. He looked at the water buckets. One was half full, the other was nearly empty. Both had been used for drinking, for broth, for wiping condensation from the walls. He stood and faced Mabel. "I said this stack would bury you or burn you," Theodore said. "It did neither. You made it carry its weight, and you gave the flames somewhere safe to breathe." He did not say it with warmth. He said it with the precision of a man correcting his own records, the same tone he would have used to amend a grain weight entry or revise a fence line survey. The admission was not affection. It was accuracy. "This does not mean every straw stack is safe," he continued. "It means this one worked because you addressed the reasons most such attempts would fail." He pointed at the four posts, the cross beams, the ribs, the wire braces. Without the frame, the roof collapses. Without the clay and iron, the straw ignites. Without the vents, the air poisons. Without the alarms, the settlement kills in silence. He looked at her. You did not make straw safe. You made a system that managed every way straw can kill. Ansel stood behind Theodore and said nothing. His expression had not changed from the careful neutrality he wore at all times, but his eyes moved across the chamber, the ribs he had taught her to build, the ventilation system they had designed together, the observation flap, the smoke test candles still sitting beside the stove. His gaze stopped at the central space where the pillar had stood, now open and clear, the arched braces holding the load he had judged too uncertain to remove. She had removed it. The roof had held. He looked at the 7-inch settlement mark and at the still ceiling above it. 7 inches in one night, and the structure had absorbed it without failure. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and stepped outside to check the exterior vents. Wilmer Doss sat against the western wall with his bandaged foot elevated on a rolled coat. He was 16 years old, and he had spent 10 hours inside a straw stack believing he was inside a building. The flour sack walls, the lamplight, the packed earth floor, the suspended bedroll. None of it had told him he was surrounded by the same material that littered every threshing ground he had ever worked. When Theodore told him the walls were straw, Wilmer touched one. He pushed his finger through the flour sack and felt the compressed stems behind it. He pulled his hand back. "The whole thing?" he asked. "The whole thing," Mabel said. Wilmer looked at the thermometer. 56 degrees. He looked at the snow visible through the entrance tunnel. He looked at his foot, which had been white when they dragged him inside, and was now pink and painful, which meant the blood had returned, which meant he would keep the toes he had expected to lose. "I thought it was a house," he said. Orrin laughed from the bedroll. It was the first time he had laughed since the involuntary, shock-driven laughter of the night before. This laugh was different, quiet, exhausted, and aimed at himself as much as at Wilmer. "I thought she was dead," Orrin said. "I rode 3 miles in a whiteout to collect a body, and she fed me rabbit." Cora Beeson arrived 2 days after the storm. She came from the direction of Goodwell on a borrowed mule, carrying a leather case that contained 2 checked mercury thermometers, a cloth measuring tape, a notebook, and a glass tube sealed at one end that she used to collect air samples for later testing. She was 31 years old, a science instructor connected with the Panhandle Agricultural Institute, and she had heard about the straw shelter from a freight driver who had heard about it from the settlement store clerk who had heard about it from Wilmer Doss. The institution was real. It had been established in 1909 and had gained an instructional farm in 1910. Cora and her measurements were dramatized, but the kind of person she represented, a trained observer associated with a functioning agricultural school, was present and plausible in the Oklahoma Panhandle by 1911. Cora did not arrive with an opinion. She arrived with instruments. She placed 1 thermometer inside the chamber and 1 outside, both at the same height. She recorded conditions at intervals over 24 hours, varying the door openings, the burner time, and the number of occupants to isolate what the straw contributed and what the stove and human bodies contributed. Her findings recorded in the notebook that Mabel would later keep beside Ansel's. With both curtains closed, no flame burning, and 1 occupant, the interior temperature exceeded the exterior by 27 to 31 degrees. The difference was largest during calm winds and smallest when gusts struck the thinned north face. With the lamp stove running at low setting for 1 hour, the interior rose an additional 9 to 12 degrees above the passive baseline. The stove contributed less heat than the straw retained, confirming that the insulation, not the flame, was the primary mechanism. When both curtains were opened simultaneously, the chamber lost 8 to 11 degrees within 15 minutes. Closing them restored the temperature over approximately 40 minutes. The entrance tunnel's turn reduced drafts by an estimated 60 to 70% compared to a straight passage. The straw directly behind the heat shield maintained 81 to 86 degrees during and after stove operation. These temperatures were elevated but below the threshold for pyrolysis. The clay daub showed hairline cracks that would need repair within weeks. Condensation near the exhaust vent accumulated at a rate that required daily wiping. If left unattended, the moisture would penetrate the straw and create conditions for the same microbial heating that Ansel had identified in the northwest shoulder before construction began. The buried frame was carrying the structural load. Without it, the chamber would have been impossible. The ribs supplemented the frame, but could not have replaced it. The 7-inch settlement was within the range Ansel had predicted for a stack of this density under storm conditions. No further movement was observed during Cora's measurement period. Cora's summary was careful and specific. She did not claim the straw shelter was a replacement for frame construction. She did not assign it an insulation rating. She did not call it safe. She said the chamber maintained a survivable temperature differential through a combination of dry straw insulation, controlled ventilation, contained flame, and structural bracing. She said the system required daily monitoring and posed genuine risks around fire, collapse, air quality that could only be managed through the protocols Mabel and Ansel had developed. She said the approach had applications for emergency shelter in treeless regions where straw was abundant and building materials were not. She asked Mabel's permission to share the measurements with the Institute's agricultural extension. Mabel said yes. The community did not convert all at once. Belief, like weather, moved across the settlement in an uneven front that reached some people before others and left pockets of resistance long after the majority had shifted. The first to come were the families who had lost roof sections during the storm. 3 frame houses had been damaged: Galen's office, a homesteader's cabin east of the road, and the settlement's communal bunkhouse. All 3 had been built with lumber that cost $12 to $18 per 100 board feet, hauled from Liberal or shipped by rail from Kansas. All 3 had failed to keep the wind out during the worst hours of the norther. Mabel's stack had cost nothing. The farmers did not come to praise her. They came to understand how she had done it. The questions were practical, detailed, and skeptical in the way that practical people are skeptical, not from malice, but from the need to know whether something would work for them. "How thick are the walls?" asked a man named Stroud, who had lost his cabin's north-facing window frame. 6 to 7 feet on the long sides, Mabel said. 5 behind the sleeping wall, 4 to 5 above the roof frame. And the frame came first? The frame was already there. The feeding rack was buried when the stacker piled straw over it. Stroud looked at the posts. He knocked his fist against one. Solid. "I do not have buried posts," he said. "Then you build a frame first," Mabel said. 4 posts, 2 crossbeams. Sink the posts before the straw goes on. The straw is the insulation. The frame is the structure. Without the frame, you're burying yourself. She would not soften the message. She would not describe the shelter as something anyone could dig into a loose pile and survive. The dangers Theodore and Ansel and even Galen had identified were real. Collapse was real. Fire was real. Suffocation was real. Internal heating was real. The shelter worked not because straw was safe, but because Mabel had addressed every specific way straw could kill. Her rules were uncompromising. Use only dry straw. Test every section with an iron rod before excavating. If the rod comes out warm and the point smells sour, remove that straw and do not use it. Never excavate without posts, a rack, or another verified support system. Mark settlement with a nail line and check it daily. Tie spoon alarms to every post. Separate flame from straw with earth, clay, and metal. Keep water beside any flame. Not near the flame, beside it. Within arm's reach. Every time. Maintain 2 ventilation paths, low intake, high exhaust. Check the draft daily with smoke. If the draft reverses, extinguish the flame immediately and clear the blockage before relighting. Build an entrance that blocks wind without preventing escape. The tunnel must turn at least once. The outer opening must be pluggable from inside. A second emergency exit must exist near the ceiling. 6 families began construction within 2 weeks of the storm. They did not build replicas of Mabel's chamber. They built smaller versions, emergency cells around existing cattle feed frames, most of them 4 feet by 6 feet, large enough for 2 adults and a blanket. Theodore supervised the framing on 3 of them, converting his earlier opposition into authority behind the safety standards. His experience with cattle shelters and frame construction made him the most qualified person in the settlement to assess whether a post and beam structure could carry a straw load, and he applied that knowledge with the thoroughness that had made him committee chairman. The school at Goodwell built a 4-person refuge bay beside its stable. The posts were new cut and properly sunk. The crossbeams were bolted. The straw was tested before stacking. The ventilation followed Mabel's specifications exactly. Low intake, high exhaust, pivoting cap, observation flap. Mabel inspected each shelter before approving the installation of a stove. 3 families passed on the first inspection. 2 required additional bracing. One had used damp straw on the north wall and had to replace it entirely. She did not charge for any of this. She did not accept payment. She shared the design because the design was not hers alone. It belonged to Ansel's knowledge, her father's observation, Orrin's practical corrections, Cora's measurements, and Theodore's structural standards. She was the person who had combined them. She was not willing to profit from a combination that might save lives if shared freely. Galen filed his claim against Mabel on the first Monday after the roads cleared. He valued the straw she had removed from the communal stack at $3.40 aigües, calculated at a rate per ton that was higher than any market price within 100 miles. He added the cost of the straw consumed by the shelter's ongoing use, the damage to the north face from erosion during the storm, and a service charge for the ring's administrative time spent reviewing the matter. The total came to $11.60. Added to the $18.70 mortgage installment, Mabel now owed Galen or his associated accounts more than $30, an amount that exceeded her total earnings from 2 years as a cook and clerk for the threshing ring. Orrin heard about the filing at the Harlan outfit and rode to the settlement that afternoon. He found Galen at the store and said one thing. "You told me she was already dead." Galen stiffened. "I said she had no chance." "You said she was dead, before anyone had checked, before I rode out. You stood by the stove and told the room she was finished, and then you tried to stop Theodore from letting anyone ride. I was protecting the men from a dangerous crossing. You were protecting yourself from a witness." The store went quiet. 3 men at the counter stopped talking. The clerk set down the feed sack he had been weighing. Orrin was not a large man, but he held himself with the compressed stillness of someone who had spent the worst night of his life inside a structure that the man in front of him had tried to destroy, and his voice carried the weight of that experience. Galen did not answer. He picked up his parcels and left the store. Theodore had already begun examining Galen's accounts. The storm had given him a reason. The damaged office roof had exposed Galen's ledgers to sleet, and the process of drying and reconstructing the records required a review that Galen could not refuse without raising suspicion. Theodore was not looking for fraud. He was looking for the discrepancies Mabel had described: the kerosene charges, the altered grain weights, the delivery dates that did not match the freight agent's schedule. He did not find them in Galen's damaged books. The sleet had dissolved most of the ink on the critical pages, but the review opened a door that Galen could not close. Other Reen members began comparing their own receipts against the figures they had been charged. Two farmers found differences, small ones. $1 here, 70 cents there. The kind of discrepancies that looked like arithmetic errors until you noticed they always ran in the same direction. Galen's accounts never shorted Galen. Ansel and Mabel spent 3 evenings in the straw chamber reconstructing delivery totals from the receipts that survived. The work was painstaking, cross-referencing dates, weights, and prices from 6 different farms against the freight agent's schedule that Mabel had memorized during her time as the ring's clerk. The relationship between them had changed. The early weeks had been teacher and student, Ansel demonstrating, Mabel repeating, Ansel correcting. The construction phase had been master and apprentice, Ansel designing, Mabel building, Ansel inspecting. Now, sitting cross-legged on the packed earth floor, with pages spread between them and the lamp stove casting its steady light across the flour sack walls, they were collaborators. Mabel understood the numbers. Ansel understood the materials and the transport logistics. Together they could reconstruct a picture that neither could have built alone. September 14th, Mabel said. Galen billed 6 gallons of kerosene. I recorded 4 from the delivery. Who drove the freight that week? Ansel asked. A man named Paulson. He runs the Liberal route. Paulson keeps his own tallies. He marks them on the wagon gate in pencil. How do you know that? Because I rode with him in '07 when my hand was healing and I could not work the stacker. He is a careful man. He will remember 4 gallons because 4 is what his wagon held on that date. Mabel wrote Paulson's name beside the entry. It was the first independent corroboration she had found, a witness who could confirm the actual delivery quantity without relying on either her copies or Galen's ledger. Ansel looked at the page. Then he looked at Mabel. His expression had not changed from its habitual neutrality, but something in his posture had shifted, a settling, the way a frame post settles when the load above it finds its balance. Your father, he said, the well digger. Owen Ives. I knew him, not well. He dug a well for the Harlan outfit in '06. I was building the stacker that year. Ansel paused. He measured twice before he dug. He carried a plumb line in his coat pocket even when he was not working. I remember thinking that was excessive for a man who dug holes for a living. Mabel set the pen down. He carried the plumb line because he had dug a well that collapsed in '03. The casing shifted because the hole was not vertical. He lost 3 weeks of work and nearly lost the customer. After that, he measured everything twice and checked it with the plumb. And he taught you to measure. He taught me to distrust my own certainty, which is the same thing. Ansel looked at the central space where the pillar had stood. The arched braces held the ceiling. The nail line on the post showed 7 inches of settlement that had not increased since the storm. That is why you left the column, he said. Not because you were afraid, because you did not trust your own certainty that it was safe to remove. And I was right not to trust it, Mabel said. The column was carrying more load than the frame could handle alone. Without the ribs and the arches, removing it would have dropped the roof. You were also wrong, Ansel said. The ribs and arches were sufficient. The column could have come out a week earlier. You lost a week of full floor space because you waited. I lost a week, Mabel agreed. I did not lose the roof. Ansel almost smiled. It was the second time she had seen it. Your father was a careful man. he said. Careful men dig fewer wells, but their wells hold water. If this story reminds you why preparation matters more than pride, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The winter that followed the Blue Norther was the worst in the Panhandle's recorded settlement history. Beaver, northeast of Goodwell, received 87.3 inches of snow between November and March. Temperatures reached single digits repeatedly. 3 storms in January alone dropped more than a foot each. Ansel worked through December and into January. He helped Mabel redesign the shelter as a reproducible system, not a hollowed mound, but a braced straw refuge with a framed core erected before straw was stacked around it. The improvements were specific and testable. A small frame of 4 posts and 2 crossbeams built to dimensions based on the available straw volume. Diagonal wire bracing at each corner, preventing the twist that Ansel had warned about during the original construction. A separate cooking alcove connected to the main chamber by a short passage, so flame and sleeping space occupied different volumes. Replaceable clay-coated panels around the stove position, because the clay would crack, and the panels would need to be removed, redaubed, and reinstalled every few weeks. A double-turn entrance instead of a single turn, because Orrin had discovered during the storm that the single turn still admitted drafts when the wind shifted to the east. A raised vent cap that shed snow instead of collecting it, the failure that had nearly killed them during the Norther. Iron rod inspection ports in each wall section, allowing the occupant to test for internal heating without dismantling the insulation. Exterior rope belts to limit the spreading that thinned walls over time. A marked no-flame sleeping zone on the opposite side from the stove alcove. A removable emergency roof hatch. Cora recorded temperatures while Mabel varied door openings and burner time. Orrin tested the entrance during strong winds and confirmed that the second turn reduced drafts more effectively than adding straw to the single-turn walls. Theodore inspected the framing and approved the diagonal bracing, noting that it solved a problem he had observed in cattle shelters for years, the slow twist of posts under asymmetric wind loads. Mabel taught by making others perform the tests. She brought Stroud to the original shelter and handed him the iron rod. "Push it into the wall," she said. 6 feet. Leave it for 20 minutes. When you pull it out, tell me what it means. Stroud pushed the rod in, waited, and withdrew it. He pressed it to his wrist. Cool. He smelled the tip. Clean. "Dry straw," he said. Mabel moved him to a section she had deliberately wetted that morning with 2 cups of water. "Again," she said. He pushed the rod in and waited. When he withdrew it, the metal was warm. The tip smelled faintly sour. Stroud pulled his hand away from his wrist. "That is how fast it starts," Mabel said. 2 cups of water in 12 hours. Imagine what a leaking roof or a broken vent does over a week. Children watch smoke move between the low intake and high exhaust. Mabel lit a candle, blew it out, and let them hold the smoking wick at different heights inside the chamber. They saw the smoke rise. They saw it bend toward the exhaust. They understood without being told that warm air moved upward and that the vent system existed to give it somewhere safe to go. Orrin demonstrated the alarm system by intentionally loosening one brace wire. The spoon struck the pan. 3 children flinched. Mabel showed them the settlement mark on the post and explained what it meant, that the roof was always moving, always pressing downward, and that the alarms existed to tell you when the movement exceeded what the frame could absorb. Theodore taught the fire bucket rule. He stood beside the stove alcove in Mabel's chamber and placed his hand on the clay daub. He held it there for 5 seconds. Then he reached for the water bucket without looking, demonstrating that the bucket must be close enough to grab by reflex, without searching, without turning, without taking his eyes off the flame. "I spent 30 years building shelters out of lumber and sod," Theodore said. I never put the water bucket within arm's reach because I trusted my walls not to burn. These walls will burn. The bucket is not caution. It is the only thing between this shelter and a bonfire. He was converting his authority, the same authority he had used to dismiss Mabel's plan, into enforcement of the safety standards that made the plan survivable. The transformation was not sentimental. Theodore did not apologize for his earlier opposition. He did not claim to have been wrong in principle. He had been right that straw shelters were dangerous. He had been wrong that dangerous and impossible were the same thing. The distinction was narrow, and he applied it with the same precision he applied to everything else. Ansel's cough began in mid-January. He did not mention it. Mabel heard it first during an evening session in the chamber when they were reviewing Cora's latest temperature recordings and planning the school refuge. A single cough, dry, short, and deep in the chest. He cleared his throat and continued talking. The next day, the cough returned, and the day after that. By the end of the week, it interrupted his sentences and left him winded after climbing the gentle slope between the road and the straw stack. Mabel said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, she set a cup of hot water with honey in front of him and waited. "It is a cold," Ansel said. "It is January," Mabel said. "And you are 63 years old, and you have been sleeping in frame houses with cracks around the walls." "I have slept in worse." "That is not a rebuttal. That is a history of poor decisions." Ansel looked at her over the cup. The expression on his face was one she had not seen before, not neutrality, not the near smile, but something closer to recognition. The young woman who had left a column standing because she did not trust her own certainty was now telling him that his certainty about his own health was equally suspect. He drank the water. He did not argue. He did not stay the night in the chamber, though Mabel offered. He walked back to the settlement in the dark, coughing every 40 yards. In the first week of February, a blizzard struck the Panhandle. Not a northern ispao, the temperature was already low, but a heavy, sustained snowfall driven by winds that dropped visibility to arm's length. The widow 3 miles north, the same widow whose chimney flashing Ansel had repaired during the Blue Norther, sent her 9-year-old son to the settlement with a message that her stove had cracked and she had no heat. Ansel went. He walked 3 miles in the snow to repair a stove he had not built in a house whose chimney he had already fixed once, for a woman whose children he could not leave unprotected. He carried tools. He carried a sack of coal. He carried the cough that had been deepening for 3 weeks. He fixed the stove. He cleared the chimney. He spent the night on the widow's floor beside the repaired stove because the wind made the return walk impossible. He walked back the next morning. The cough was worse. By evening, the cough was producing fluid. By the second evening, he could not walk from the settlement bunkhouse to the outhouse without stopping twice to breathe. Mabel came for him. She brought the canvas bedroll and the dry blanket and told him the straw chamber was warmer than anything in the settlement, and he would recover faster in 58 degrees with clean air than in a frame bunkhouse with a leaking chimney. Ansel refused. "The widow's children may need the space," he said. "If the storm continues, the school road will close, and those children will need shelter closer than Goodwell." "Then we will build a second chamber," Mabel said. "With what frame?" She had no answer. The second chamber required posts and crossbeams, and the nearest timber was in Liberal. She could not build a frame from straw alone. Ansel died 4 days later in Theodore's house. Pneumonia. The same disease that had killed Mabel's father in 1909. The same disease that came for people whose lungs worked in cold air and whose bodies could not fight the infection that followed. His final instruction was not poetic. He was sitting propped against the wall of Theodore's spare room with a blanket across his knees and the iron testing rod lying beside him because he had been holding it when the fever made his grip unreliable. "Never trust a quiet alarm," he said. "Check why it stopped." He meant the spoon alarms on the posts. If one stopped clicking during a storm, it might mean the settlement had stabilized, or it might mean the thread had broken and the roof was moving without warning. The lesson applied to stoves, to vents, to symptoms that disappeared without treatment. Silence was not safety. Silence was the absence of information. He died the next morning. Theodore notified the settlement. Orrin dug the grave because the ground was frozen, and the work required a young man with a pick and the willingness to strike frozen earth for 4 hours. Mabel did not attend the burial. She sat in the straw chamber with Ansel's iron rod across her knees and his damaged notebook open on the floor beside her. The rod still carried the polished mark where his hand had held it for 30 years, a smooth, bright oval on the dark iron where the friction of 10,000 insertions into straw stacks had worn the metal clean. His 3 good fingers and 2 stumps had gripped that exact spot so many times that the rod remembered him. She closed the notebook. She placed the rod against the wall. She checked the observation flap, the vent draft, the thermometer, and the water buckets. Then she checked the spoon alarms, every thread, every connection, every pan. None of them had stopped. All of them were still measuring. The school wagon failed to arrive on a Thursday afternoon in late February. 6 children had left Goodwell that morning in a wagon driven by a 14-year-old boy named Cass, who had made the 12-mile trip 60 times without incident. The road was packed snow over frozen earth, manageable for a team of 2 horses who knew the route by memory. The sky was overcast but not threatening. The wind was 15 miles per hour from the northwest, cold but not dangerous. At 2 o'clock, the wind increased to 30. At 2:30, snow began falling. By 3 o'clock, the road was invisible and the horses had stopped. Cass unhitched the team and tried to lead them by hand. The lead horse refused to move. The second horse turned sideways to the wind and stood still. 6 children sat in the wagon bed under a canvas tarp that cracked and snapped above them. At the settlement, the school's newly built straw refuge was incomplete. The posts were set, the crossbeams bolted, the straw stacked to a height of 8 feet on 3 sides. But the high vent had not been fitted. The exhaust pipe lay beside the refuge in pieces, waiting for assembly. Without the exhaust, the refuge could shelter bodies from wind, but could not safely support a flame. Without a flame, the insulation alone would maintain a temperature perhaps 20 degrees above the exterior, survivable but frigid, adequate for adults, dangerous for children who were already cold and wet. Mabel arrived at the school refuge at 3:15. She had walked from the straw stack through the building storm after Stroud's son had come running to tell her the wagon was overdue. She assessed the situation in the time it took to walk around the unfinished refuge. Posts, beams, straw on 3 sides, open on the south where the stacking had not been completed. No vent, no stove position, no entrance tunnel. She did not have time to build what was missing. She had time to adapt what existed. She pulled Ansel's movable vent cap from her coat. She had been carrying it since his death, not as a memorial, but because the design was his best piece of engineering, and she had been planning to duplicate it for 2 other shelters. The cap was a pivoting tin assembly on a wire frame that could be mounted on any pipe section and adjusted to face away from the prevailing wind. She found a straight section of stove pipe in the school supply shed and wired it vertically through the straw on the refuge's north wall, extending it 2 feet above the crown. She mounted the cap. She cut a low intake hole on the south side, the side that was still open, and packed straw around the pipe to seal the gap. The entrance was the open south face. She could not build a tunnel in the time remaining. She hung a canvas sheet from the crossbeam, creating a single curtain that would block the wind's direct path but would not provide the airlock that the double-turn entrance provided in her own shelter. It was not enough. A single curtain on an open face would lose heat faster than the stove could replace it. But 6 children in the wind was worse than 6 children behind an imperfect curtain with a flame. Orrin arrived on horseback at 3:40. He had heard about the missing wagon from a hand at the Harlan outfit and had ridden toward the school road. "I need rope," Mabel said, "and I need you to follow the road north until you find them." "In this?" "Cass is 14. The youngest child is 7. The wagon has been stopped for at least an hour." Orrin took the rope. He tied one end to the school's fence post and rode north, playing the rope out behind him. Mabel stacked straw against the open south face of the refuge, leaving only the curtained entrance gap. Orrin found the wagon at 1.25 miles. The horses were standing with their rumps to the wind, snow collecting on their backs. Cass sat on the driver's bench, holding the reins of a team that had not moved in 40 minutes. His hands were locked around the leather. The 6 children under the canvas tarp were silent. One of the children was Galen Fitch's 9-year-old niece. Orrin loaded the smaller children onto his horse, 2 at a time, riding back along the rope to the refuge and returning for the next pair. Cass walked, leading the team. The rope kept them on the road. The wind tried to turn them sideways. The snow was ankle-deep and building. All 6 children reached the refuge. Mabel lit the lamp stove inside the makeshift shelter. The single curtain leaked. The temperature never rose above 49 degrees. But the children were dry, out of the wind, and drinking warm water within 10 minutes of their arrival. The stove stayed on its lowest setting. The movable vent cap drew correctly on its first test. The air inside smelled like straw and kerosene and damp wool. The smell of a place that was not the open plain. The chamber never reached 50 degrees. The single curtain entrance lost heat that a tunnel would have retained. The open fourth wall, hastily packed with loose straw, was thinner than the other 3 and admitted cold in drafts that the children could feel against their backs. It was imperfect. It was insufficient by the standards Mabel had established in her own shelter, and it kept 7 children alive through a night when the temperature outside dropped to 4 degrees, and the road between Goodwell and the settlement became impassable. By morning, Cass's hands had uncurled. The youngest child was asleep against the stove alcove wall with her coat pulled over her head. Galen's niece sat awake with her knees drawn to her chest, watching Mabel check the vent cap through the observation flap. "Is this a house?" the girl asked. "No," Mabel said. "It is the reason you do not need one tonight." Mabel had applied the method beyond the original stack. She had done it without Ansel. She had done it with incomplete materials under time pressure, in conditions that violated half the rules she had written, and the children were alive because the core principles, insulation, ventilation, flame separation, structural support, held even when the implementation was imperfect. Ansel's voice was in every decision she had made, not his words, his method. Test before you commit, check the draft before you light the flame, trust the physics, not the hope. Never trust a quiet alarm. Galen came to the school refuge the morning the roads cleared. He came alone. He did not bring the ledger or the claim paperwork or any of the instruments of authority he had been using against Mabel since October. He stood outside the curtained entrance and waited until Mabel came out. "My niece," he said. "Eleanor. She is inside. Her feet are warm. She ate twice last night." Galen looked at the refuge. He looked at the straw walls, the tin vent cap turning slowly in the morning wind, the stovepipe emerging from the north face. He looked at the canvas curtain, stiff with frost, hanging from the crossbeam. "Thank you," he said. The words cost him something. Mabel could see it, a tightening around his mouth, a stiffness in his shoulders, the posture of a man swallowing something that tasted like the opposite of everything he had been feeding himself since October. Then he added, "I will cancel the debt if you return the ledger pages." Mabel looked at him for a long time. The sky behind him was pale blue. The snow reflected so much light that his face was shadowless, every line and mark and calculation visible. "No," she said. Galen's jaw tightened. "I have offered you. You have offered me silence in exchange for evidence. That's not a gift. That is a purchase." Galen left. He did not slam anything or raise his voice or make threats that the settlement could witness. He walked to his wagon, climbed onto the bench, and drove toward the settlement with Eleanor beside him. The girl looked back at the refuge once. Galen did not. Theodore called the public accounting meeting for the second Saturday in March, when the roads were passable and the worst of the winter had released its grip on the Panhandle. He posted the notice at the settlement store, the school, and the gate of the Harlan cattle outfit. The notice did not mention Galen by name. It said only that the threshing ring's annual accounts required review and that all members holding receipts should bring them. Galen understood what it meant. He spent the 3 days before the meeting at his damaged grain office, sorting through the ledgers that the November sleet had partially destroyed. Some pages were legible. Others had dissolved into pulp, the ink running in streaks that turned precise figures into abstract stains. The pages that survived were the ones that had been stored in the lower drawers, below the level where the water had reached. The pages that were destroyed were the ones that had sat on the desktop and the upper shelves, the current season's records, the ones that contained the entries Mabel had questioned. Whether the placement was deliberate or accidental, Galen never said. The effect was the same. The most recent and most incriminating records were gone. What remained were older accounts from seasons before Mabel had worked for the ring, accounts that showed the same pattern, the same directional errors, the same small differences that always benefited the treasurer. The meeting took place in the settlement's largest building, a combination church and meeting hall with a plank floor and windows on 3 sides that let in the flat March light. 27 ring members attended. Theodore sat at the front table with the surviving ledgers, a stack of individual receipts contributed by 6 families, and Mabel's 3 copied pages. Mabel presented her evidence in categories, not in anger. The first category was the copied ledger entries. 3 pages in her handwriting showing grain weights, delivery dates, and fuel charges as she had recorded them during her employment. She acknowledged that the pages were copies, not originals, and that Galen had disputed their accuracy. The second category was the freight agent's records. Paulson, the liberal freight driver, had returned to the settlement in February. Ansel had been right. Paulson kept tallies on his wagon gate in pencil, and he remembered the September 14th kerosene delivery because 4 gallons was the maximum his half-rack could carry on that route. He had written a statement confirming the quantity. 4 gallons delivered. Galen had billed 6. The third category was Galen's own surviving invoices. The older ledgers, recovered from the lower drawers after the roof failure, showed a pattern that extended back at least 3 seasons. Fuel charges exceeded deliveries by 10 to 15%. Grain weights recorded at Galen's scale ran 2 to 4% below the weights recorded at the rail depot when the same grain was shipped. The differences were small, They were consistent, and they always favored the treasurer. The fourth category was the testimony of 6 families who had compared their personal receipts against Galen's charges. 2 had found specific discrepancies: the dollar and the 70 cents that Theodore had identified during the post-storm review. 4 others found no individual errors large enough to dispute, but acknowledged that the cumulative pattern, when laid alongside Paulson's statement and Mabel's copies, described something more than arithmetic mistakes. Galen sat in the 3rd row. He listened without interrupting. His face held the expression of a man performing calculations. Not arithmetic, but social mathematics, measuring how many people in the room had already decided and how many remained persuadable. When Mabel finished, Galen stood. "These are clerical errors," he said. "I have managed the Ring's accounts for 11 years. I have handled thousands of entries. Errors occur. They are corrected when they are found." He looked around the room. If every discrepancy is fraud, then every farmer here who has ever miscounted a bushel is a thief. The argument was reasonable. It was the same argument that had protected him for 11 years. The sheer volume of transactions made occasional errors inevitable, and the accuser bore the burden of proving intent rather than incompetence. Theodore spoke from the front table. "The errors run in one direction, Galen. In 11 years of accounts, I have not found a single entry that shorted you." The room was quiet. 27 people sat with their receipts and their memories and the accumulated weight of small differences that had never seemed worth challenging individually. Eleanor stood up. She was 9 years old. She stood in the aisle between the plank benches, with her hands at her sides, and her chin raised, and said what she had come to say. Miss Ives did not ask whose child I was before she opened the curtain. The sentence was not evidence. It was not a legal argument. It was a 9-year-old girl telling a room full of adults that the woman her uncle had tried to destroy had saved her life without conditions, without asking her name, without checking whether she was related to the man who held the debt. Galen looked at his niece. His social mathematics collapsed. The room was no longer calculating discrepancies. The room was seeing a man who had tried to freeze a woman to death and a girl who had been kept alive by the woman he had tried to freeze. Galen sat down. Theodore asked him to address the freight agent's statement. Galen said Paulson might have miscounted. Theodore asked him to explain the pattern in the older ledgers. Galen said patterns were not proof. Theodore asked him whether he wished to continue as treasurer while the Ring conducted a full audit. Galen did not wish to continue as treasurer. The specific resolution took another hour. Mabel did not demand jail. She did not demand public humiliation. She demanded 3 things: corrected accounts for every family that had been overcharged, based on the surviving records and Paulson's statements; release of the mortgage on her father's quarter section, which Galen held and which had been the instrument of her expulsion; repayment to every affected family, funded by the sale of Galen's grain office and its equipment. Galen signed the mortgage release at the front table. His hand was steady. His face was empty. He looked at Mabel once as he pushed the paper across the table and said what he had apparently been carrying since October. "I expected the winter to remove you before the figures could matter." Mabel took the paper. She folded it once and placed it inside her coat, against the same ribs that had carried the copied ledger pages since the day of her expulsion. "The figures mattered before the winter," she said. Galen left the meeting hall. He did not leave the county. The repayment required him to sell the grain office, the building, the scale, the storage bins, and the water rights attached to the lot. The sale took 4 months and covered most of what he owed. He worked the following season as a hired hand on a ranch south of Beaver, doing the kind of labor he had spent 11 years positioning himself above. His conversion was not sentimental. He did not apologize to Mabel. He did not acknowledge that the expulsion had been manufactured. He paid what the ring required, relinquished the positions that had given him leverage, and lived the rest of his years in the county as a man whose neighbors remembered what he had done and what had been done to correct it. The grudging quality of his compliance was, in its own way, more honest than a tearful confession would have been. He had not changed his nature. He had lost the power to act on it. Orrin did not propose after the rescue. He did not propose after the accounting meeting. He did not propose during the weeks when the snow melted and the roads dried, and the settlement began the slow process of repairing the storm damage and preparing for spring planting. He proposed after the mortgage was filed. The distinction mattered to both of them. Orrin was not interested in rescuing Mabel. He had tried that once, on the night of the Norther, and she had rescued him instead. He was not interested in providing for her. She had provided for herself through the worst winter in the Panhandle's recorded history, using materials that everyone else had discarded. He was not interested in completing her story, as though she were a narrative that required a man's arrival to reach its conclusion. He was interested in the work. He had spent the winter and early spring testing the shelter improvements alongside Mabel and Cora. He had crawled through the entrance tunnels in high wind, measuring draft reduction. He had argued for wider entrances, not for comfort, but for the practical necessity of moving an injured person through a turning passage on a bedroll. Mabel had resisted, pointing out that wider entrances admitted more cold air. They had compromised on a passage width of 30 inches, narrow enough to limit drafts and wide enough to pass a person lying flat. He had discovered the double-turn principle during the Norther, when the single-turn entrance had admitted gusts that rattled the inner curtain and dropped the temperature 4 degrees in 10 minutes. 2 turns, he argued, would break the wind's path twice. Mabel agreed, but noted that 2 turns required a longer tunnel, which meant more excavation, more straw removal, and a longer path to the exterior in an emergency. They had solved the problem together by offsetting the turns. The first turn 90 degrees to the left, the second 45 degrees to the right, creating a zigzag that broke the wind more effectively than 2 right angles while keeping the total tunnel length under 7 feet. That collaboration, the patient, incremental, sometimes argumentative process of finding the solution that neither of them would have reached alone, was the foundation of whatever existed between them. It was not romantic. It was not sentimental. It was 2 people who respected each other's competence, discovering that their competences were complementary. Orrin corrected Mabel's belief that a larger flame always warmed a shelter faster. He had observed during the Norther that the stove at its lowest setting raised the temperature steadily, while a higher setting produced more heat but also more exhaust, which required more ventilation, which admitted more cold air. The net gain from a higher flame was smaller than the net gain from a lower flame in a better sealed space. The principle was counterintuitive, and Mabel had resisted it until Cora confirmed it with side-by-side measurements. Mabel corrected Orrin's assumption that thicker walls were always better. Beyond 6 feet of dry straw, additional thickness produced diminishing returns in insulation while increasing the distance between the occupant and the exterior, making vent maintenance harder, emergency exits longer, and structural repairs more difficult. The optimal wall thickness, based on Cora's measurements and Mabel's experience, was 5 to 7 feet, depending on the straw's density and the prevailing wind direction. They spent one summer constructing a permanent sod and straw demonstration building near Goodwell. The structure was conventional on the outside: sod walls, a timber roof, a proper door and window, but its north and west sides used thick straw infill protected by earthen plaster. The infill occupied the space between the sod's inner face and a secondary plank wall, creating a 4-foot insulating cavity that performed, by Cora's measurements, nearly as well as the original straw stack chamber. The building was not a straw shelter. It was a permanent structure that incorporated the principles Mabel had discovered under duress and refined through months of testing. The distinction was important to her. She never claimed to have invented straw insulation. People had been packing straw into walls and roofs for centuries. She described her contribution as a safe emergency system for people who possess straw but lack time or lumber. The demonstration building showed how those emergency principles could be incorporated into permanent construction. Orrin proposed in May of 1913, after Mabel had completed the final mortgage release filing at the county office in Guyman. He proposed not at the office, but at the straw stack, which still stood on the threshing ground with its entrance tunnel open and its flour sack curtains faded from gold to white. He proposed because the filing meant the land was free, the debt was cleared, and the woman standing beside him had accomplished every practical goal she had set for herself during the worst 5 months of her life. She did not need him. She did not need anyone, and the absence of need made the presence of partnership honest in a way that dependency could not. Mabel said yes. They married in spring 1913. The ceremony was small. Theodore, Cora, Stroud, and the widow, whose chimney Ansel had repaired twice. Eleanor came without Galen's permission and stood beside the widow's children. Mabel and Orrin established a small boarding and demonstration farm on the quarter section that Owen Ives had filed before his death. The central building was conventional: sod walls, timber framing, a proper stove with a proper chimney. They built it with lumber purchased from the mortgage repayment funds and labor provided by 3 settlement families who worked in exchange for Mabel's help, designing straw-insulated outbuildings on their own properties. The farm was never prosperous in the way that wheat operations or cattle outfits were prosperous. It was a working demonstration of what could be built with local materials and careful engineering. Visitors came, not many, but steadily, to see the sod and straw demonstration building, to examine the braced refuge bay beside the stable, and to hear Mabel explain the rules that separated a survivable shelter from a death trap. Over the next 3 winters, 31 farms built some form of braced refuge bay. Not all were 8 feet square. Some held only a bench, a water crock, blankets, and a storm lantern, minimum emergency spaces designed to keep a stranded person alive until conditions improved. Others were larger, built around existing structures, incorporating the ventilation and flame separation principles that Mabel and Ansel had developed. The settlement school maintained 2 refuge bays: the original 4-person chamber that had been completed after the February storm, and a smaller 2-person bay beside the road for use by stranded travelers. Ranchers created versions beside distant line camps, where cowboys riding fence in winter might be caught by a storm miles from the nearest building. Theodore inspected every one. He checked the framing, the bracing, the vent systems, and the fire bucket positions. He rejected 4 shelters during the first winter: 3 for insufficient bracing, and 1 for using straw that failed the iron rod test. The rejections were not popular. Theodore did not care about popularity. He cared about the distinction between a shelter that worked and a shelter that killed, and he enforced that distinction with the authority of a man who had been wrong once and did not intend to be wrong again. The Panhandle Agricultural Institute circulated a 1-page safety sheet based on Mabel and Ansel's tests. Cora wrote it. Mabel reviewed it. Theodore approved it. The sheet emphasized bracing, dryness, ventilation, and flame separation. It did not include temperature claims or insulation ratings. It did not promise comfort. It promised that a person who followed the instructions would have a better chance of surviving a storm than a person who did not. The first rule was underlined twice: no chamber without a frame. The second warned that a warm stack may be heating internally rather than protecting its occupant. Mabel and Orrin raised 2 children, a son born in 1914 and a daughter born in 1916. The children grew up in a house where measurement was a reflex. 2 thermometers hung in every room, one beside the stove and one against the coldest wall. Mabel trusted neither comfort nor fear without measuring it. If the warm thermometer read 70 and the cold thermometer read 40, the wall was losing heat and needed inspection. If both read 60, the insulation was working and the stove could be turned down. The children learned to check the vent cap before lighting a flame. They learned the iron rod test before they learned to saddle a horse. They learned that a quiet alarm meant either safety or a broken thread, and that the difference between the two was the difference between sleeping and dying. Orrin taught them to ride and to read cattle. Mabel taught them to read numbers. She held bookkeeping sessions for young women at the school twice a month, not because she believed every woman would become a clerk, but because a woman who could read her own accounts could not be cheated by a man who kept the books. 3 of her students found discrepancies in their family's accounts with the new threshing ring treasurer. The discrepancies were genuine arithmetic errors, not fraud. The treasurer corrected them without complaint. The system worked because the people being served by it could verify its accuracy. Mabel never became wealthy. The farm produced enough to sustain the family, to board occasional visitors, and to maintain the demonstration buildings. The mortgage was cleared. The debt was gone. The land remained in the family. She kept Ansel's iron rod in the hall beside the front door, standing upright in a bucket like an umbrella. Visitors who did not know its purpose assumed it was a fireplace poker. Visitors who did know, the farmers who had pushed it into their own straw walls and pressed it against their own wrists, recognized it the way a person recognizes a teacher's handwriting. The polished oval where Ansel's hand had gripped it for 30 years remained bright. Mabel never polished it. The metal held its own memory. She also kept his notebook. It was a small, cloth-bound ledger, not unlike the one Galen had used to manage the ring's accounts, filled with observations about straw density, settlement rates, moisture thresholds, and combustion temperatures. The handwriting was cramped and precise, the letters formed by a man with 3 good fingers who had taught himself to write with the hand that remained after the hand he was born with was taken by a machine. Mabel added her own observations in the margins, temperature readings, vent measurements, the results of experiments Ansel had proposed but never lived to conduct. The notebook sat beside her bed until the day she could no longer read it. By then, her daughter had copied its contents into a school composition book and added 3 pages of her own, refinements to the vent cap design, observations about straw density from different wheat varieties, and a note about the optimal angle for a zigzag entrance passage that her parents had debated for a decade without resolving. The original straw stack was gradually consumed. Each season, settlement families removed straw for cattle bedding, for garden mulch, for temporary windbreaks. The thick walls thinned. The entrance tunnel widened as the surrounding material was forked away. The flour sack curtains, bleached white by 18 months of sun and moisture, were taken down and used as grain covers. By the 3rd spring, the chamber was open on 2 sides. By the 4th, only the frame remained, 4 posts, 2 crossbeams, 12 wire-tied ribs standing in the air without the straw that had given them purpose. The ribs still held their shape, curved upward like the bones of a vessel whose hull had dissolved. The packed earth floor darkened in the rain and dried in the sun. The clay-daubed stove alcove crumbled into reddish powder. The ventilation pipes were salvaged for other shelters. The spoon alarms were untied, and the spoons returned to the kitchens that had donated them. What remained was the skeleton of a room that had held 58 degrees while the world outside reached 14. The skeleton had no insulation value. It had no warmth. It stood in the wind that had tried to kill its occupant, and the wind passed through it without resistance because the material that had resisted was gone. Mabel visited the frame in late autumn of the year her daughter copied the notebook. She was not young. Her hands, which had split open during the first week of cutting and had never fully healed, the scars ran along the tendons from her fingers to her wrists like the lines on a map, held the iron rod the way Ansel had held it, not as a tool, as an extension of the practice of measuring what was real. She walked between the four posts. The earth beneath her feet was still compacted from months of occupation. A fragment of baling wire black with rust curled beside the southeastern post. The dark circle where the stove tray had sat was still visible, a permanent mark on the ground where iron and earth and fire had met. She hung Ansel's rod from the nearest post on a wire loop. Below it, she placed the mercury thermometer that Orrin had carried into the chamber on the night of the norther, the small instrument that had read 62 degrees while Orrin stood shaking in the entrance with sleet melting from his eyebrows. The glass was broken. The mercury was gone. But the case remained, and the numbers on its face were still legible. Mabel scratched a mark beside the thermometer with the point of a nail. 2 digits and a degree symbol pressed into the weathered wood of the post. 58 degrees. And beneath that mark, in letters small enough that a person would have to step close to read them, the wind stayed outside. Within 3 winters, 31 farms and 2 public buildings maintained braced straw refuge spaces in the Oklahoma Panhandle. Not all were 8 feet square. Some held only a bench, water, blankets, and a lantern. The important detail was not how many stacks people hollowed. It was how many stopped treating discarded straw as useless while respecting the ways it could kill. A copy of Mabel and Ansel's instruction sheet hung beside the Goodwell school door with the first rule underlined twice: no chamber without a frame. Mabel lived the rest of her adult life near Goodwell with Orrin. The mortgage was cleared. The farm remained in the family. Her children remembered 2 thermometers in every room and a mother who trusted neither comfort nor fear without measuring it. She kept Ansel's iron rod in the hall until the day she could not carry it. Her daughter moved it to the post where it had hung before, in the open air, where the wind could reach it. The blue norther struck on November 11th, 1911. The temperature fell 57 degrees in 3 hours. Wind drove snow sideways across the treeless Panhandle. Orrin Peak rode 3 miles in the whiteout, expecting to recover a body. Theodore Kipp had said the stack would either bury her or burn her. It had settled 7 inches. The blocked vent had threatened to poison the air. The burner had stood within walls made of fuel. Theodore had been right about every danger. He had been wrong only in believing that danger and failure were the same thing. 4 bare posts stand where the stack once rose. Snow passes between them because the straw is gone. Ansel's iron rod hangs from one post. The thermometer's glass is broken. The number Mabel scratched beside it is still visible, 58 degrees, and beneath it, almost erased by weather, 4 words. The wind stayed outside.